Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with Isaac Hess. Isaac has been on Pints with Aquinas and has talked about his conversion story from being Mormon to being Catholic. And so I'm very excited today to be with Isaac to talk about the Hansen versus Horn debate on Pints with Aquinas. Isaac reached out to me on Patreon, and also Isaac is one of my patrons, so I'm very thankful for your patronage. And let me just have you introduce yourself very briefly. I gave you a little bit of an introduction, but Isaac, just you take it away from here.
Yeah, thanks, Swan. Thank you for having me on your channel. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and hopefully it'll be fruitful for anyone who might be interested in the topic, whether it's Latter-day Saints, Catholics, other Christians, any random person that YouTube thinks should watch this video. So my name's Isaac. I live in Arizona. I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. I was baptized in 2021. And prior to that, I was LDS. I was raised Mormon, and finally left the LDS tradition in 2018, somewhere around there, and kind of had a long spiritual journey, which I detailed in my interview with Matt. So I'm not going to recap that here. If people are interested in kind of hearing the ins and outs of how an LDS guy becomes Catholic, please enjoy watching that video. But yeah, I'm just looking forward for an opportunity to discuss the debate that Jacob Hansen and Trent Horn had.
Right. And I'll just add really quick, too, that before I watch this debate, I know a little bit here and there about Mormonism. I've had Mormon friends in my life. Everybody knows that Mormons are very well put together people. They're very kind, very nice. And typically our exposure to Mormons is I don't know, through South Park or just some other, popular cultural medium. Right. And I think Hansen said something at the start that stood out to me. I think it was in his opening statement where people just immediately laugh off Mormons without really maybe listening to them and just seeing what arguments they can offer. And so I thought that this debate was very effective, I guess, in giving people an introduction to what Mormon apologetics would actually look like from somebody who's a Mormon. And so I think we can appreciate Hansen doing that. On the other hand, Isaac, I think that you wanted to really weigh in on some of Hansen's arguments for Mormonism. And so maybe we can get into your presentation now, where you're just going to look through the debate itself. And then let me just pull up the presentation. As you go through the presentation, I'll be looking at the comments. And for those of you who are watching, we will take your questions at the end. And throughout, I might kind of pepper in my own questions as you're presenting, Isaac, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. Yeah.
All right, Isaac, you take it away.
Take it away. All right. I don't necessarily intend this to be a lecture. So, if you want to jump in with questions. So I already mentioned that I grew up LDS, left the LDS church in 2018 and became Catholic in 2021. And I just want to say at the outset, and I'll say this, I hope, a number of times during the presentation, that I have great respect for Latter-day Saints. My family, many of my family and friends are still LDS. My own wife is still an active believing Latter-day Saint. So, could be a whole nother topic about how she and I navigate this in our marriage. We have great love for each other, deep commitment. We have 4 children. It's not always easy, but honestly, it's wonderful to be married to a Latter-day Saint. She's a really amazing, incredible person. So I'm not coming at this from a position of anger. I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not trying to disparage any Latter-day Saints or even their beliefs. But I do want to talk about the debate itself. There were a lot of Catholics who, as you said, Swan, are unfamiliar with Mormon apologetics. You may have just a basic introduction to Mormonism. You may have seen something put out by something like Catholic Answers discussing Mormonism, or Jimmy Akin or whatever. Most Catholic apologists end up with a video or two or a pamphlet or an article talking about Mormonism and contrasting it to Catholicism and that sort of thing. A lot of times their engagements with Mormonism can be pretty shallow, and it's simply just due to a lack of familiarity, right? A lot of times the way they engage with it is in a way that an LDS person would just kind of think, well, that's not a good engagement with my faith, right? So, but when Hansen was giving his case for the Book of Mormon, I think a lot of Catholics, well, I know some of them were, because they reached out to me and I saw some in the comments, we're just kind of surprised, right? Like Hansen said at the beginning, a lot of people think the Book of Mormon is just a joke. And he showed that with a good presentation, it's not a joke, right? He's put forth a lot of reasons why, in his mind, it's reasonable to believe in the Book of Mormon. There were, however, times when I felt like the arguments that he put forward, a Catholic audience and even Trent weren't familiar enough with the kind of intra-Mormon discussion to really offer context or rebuttal, for instance, to some of the things that he was saying. So that was kind of like the motivation for this presentation, is just to add, it's really just an attempt to further the conversation. This is not an attempt. In fact, I think that's my next slide. That's right. This presentation is not an attempt to debunk Mormonism. It's not an attempt to mock Mormonism. And it also won't be an attempt to cover or counter every argument that was put forward in the debate by either side. There's not enough time for that. But it is just an attempt to kind of continue the conversation, bring in additional context, and in a few instances, perhaps, if I can say charitably, correct some of the things that Jacob said with just like a little bit of more information.
Right. So it's not so much that you're trying to do the comprehensive response to Mormonism. You're looking at specific things that Hansen said, adding some nuance and clarifications or qualifications, so on and so forth, that otherwise, I wouldn't know about, or somebody who hasn't studied this deeply would probably not know about.
Yeah, that's kind of my goal here, right? And there were a couple of times where the topic veered away from. Mostly, we're going to stay on the Book of Mormon. I have this here, yeah. So first thing I want to cover is just a brief discussion about just evidence and faith in general and how those two things relate together. Because a lot of the discussion was, especially from Jacob, was just sort of kind of throwing out a whole bunch of things. So how do you explain this? What do you think about that? Right? Look at this fact. Isn't that intriguing? Doesn't that seem to kind of point in favor of the Book of Mormon? So I want to just kind of have a brief discussion of how to evaluate evidence and what that means for our faith, especially from a Catholic point of view. And then we'll go over his arguments for the Book of Mormon, talking about like archaeological evidence, internal textual evidence, that sort of thing. And then we'll discuss the Book of Mormon Witnesses. Hansen talked a lot about the Book of Mormon Witnesses. And then just briefly have a discussion of Joseph Smith's polygamy, because that did come up in the debate a number of times. That was one of Trent's arguments, is that Joseph Smith does not meet the moral qualifications to be a prophet, and therefore should make us both question his honesty. That was Trent's kind of main point, but also the integrity of Joseph Smith. And I just want to, go ahead.
When we get to the part on polygamy, they talked about, I think Hansen said that, Joseph Smith was married to one woman, but sealed to, like, I forget if it was 12 others or something like that, or some number. And I don't think they ever defined what they meant by being sealed. And so I kind of wanted to know, like, wait, what is this term? So maybe remind me to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah. I will make sure that I cover that.
Okay.
Including the night he was married to at least 34 other women by the time he died. So I want to just say here at the end, just these two quotes from scriptures that are very near and dear to my heart. First one is just probably my favorite chapter in all of Scripture, 1 Corinthians 13. Just to remind ourselves that if we have not love, we gain nothing. So whatever it is that we're attempting to do here, I hope, and I've been praying all week, that this can be something that flows out of a space of love and a desire in the end to seek Christ. That's our goal here as Catholics. That's Latter-day Saints will tell you that is also their goal, is to seek Christ. And so regardless of what one thinks about the theological differences between the faiths, we can agree that is a beautiful goal, and that's what we're after. And then this very famous verse from 1 Peter, where it says to always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience. So if I feel like I'm coming across as overly negative or critical, please correct me. I would love for you to do that even in the middle of this. So let's go ahead and jump on.
All right.
Okay. So I want to just talk about evidence real quick. Like, what is evidence? So here's a basic definition. Evidence is a fact which, being true, alters the probability of a proposition being true. Okay. So if you're thinking of some sort of proposition like John killed Jack. Okay. There's many things that could be true or untrue about that. Many evidences that could lead you to think that. So, for instance, John was seen arguing with Jack that day. Okay, if that's true, that increases the probability of the proposition that John killed Jack, right? If John was actually in Jamaica at the time of the murder, that is something that decreases the probability of John killing Jack. So an evidence is any fact which, if that fact is true, it will alter the probability of a proposition being true. If it doesn't change the probability at all, like it was sunny that day, so that's a fact perhaps. Maybe on the day of the murder it was sunny. Well, that has no bearing on the proposition of whether John killed Jack. So it's not evidence either for or against, because evidence can be evidence in favor or evidence against, right? The other thing to note just about evidence in general is that when we're analyzing evidence, the strength of evidence for a proposition is not merely in the number of evidences, but the quality of the evidences of available. And by quality, I don't mean like good or bad. I mean the type, right? So the qualitative differences of evidences. So I want to give an example, and I get this example from Pat Flynn, who I think you know, Swan.
Yeah, very good friend.
And I think he got it from somebody else. Okay. But I really like this example because it illustrates really well. Suppose you are on a ramble through the woods, maybe not even on a trail. You're just kind of wandering through the trees, and you're far from any road. You're far from any house, any other humans. And you come across a cabin in the wood, and it's just derelict. Okay. So it's run down. It seems to be rotting. There's moss growing on the walls. And you think to yourself, I'm going to explore this place, this kind of old abandoned cabin. And you kind of have formed this proposition in your mind, this cabin is abandoned. And you get to the front door and there's no front door, right? And the windows are some of them are broken and cracked. And as you walk in the front room, there's no furniture. Okay. So you are accumulating evidences that this cabin is abandoned, right? You may have just sort of naturally come to this proposition, but like everything's great. This is so happening, right? This cabin is abandoned. As you explore the cabin, you turn and you walk into the kitchen, and you see there an old falling apart kitchen table, but on the kitchen table is a freshly made cup of tea, and it's steaming. Okay. Now, that one piece of evidence that there's a freshly steaming cup of tea suddenly alters the proposition of the cabin being abandoned so thoroughly that you would be irrational to continue to believe that the cabin is permanently abandoned, right? Like there's just someone's using this cabin for something, right? Because fresh cups of tea don't pop into existence out of nowhere, nor do people go on long rambles with them, right? With like a dainty little teacup and saucer and place them on a table someone's nearby, basically, is what this means. And if you were to talk to someone and they would say something like, no, I still believe the cabin's abandoned. Let me give you all these evidences, right? There's no door. It's rotting. No one's taking care of it. The windows are broken. There's no furniture in like the parts of the cabin that I saw. And that's all fine. But if the reasonable thing to respond with is say, yeah, but there was a steaming, freshly made cup of tea. That is a qualitatively different type of evidence that's so strong that it should discount these more suggestive pieces of evidence that you encountered before. Okay. And then the second one that I had was just like the idea of a crime with an alibi, which I kind of mentioned before, right? If there's some sort of crime and you have a suspect and there's many, many reasons to believe that this person may have committed the crime, but then you come across, say, definitive evidence that this person was out of the country when the crime was committed. Well, it wouldn't matter how much other evidence you had accumulated. If your certainty that piece of evidence is true, right, that they were actually out of the country, it wouldn't matter that they maybe have a witness that says that you did it. or that, that someone like you did it. You fit the profile. You've been known to hate the person that maybe if this is like a murder or something, right? That you had motive, means, and opportunity, like all those things. Although I suppose you wouldn't have had an opportunity if you had an alibi. But so this, I think, is just a good discussion. And I kind of summarize it in this bottom bullet point here, which is that false propositions can have evidence in their favor. If you take evidence as the definition I said at the top, there can be facts which are true and which increase the probability of a false proposition being true, even though it happens to be false, right? So, so obviously, how is this pertinent to our discussion today? Well, when we're evaluating something like the Book of Mormon and whether it's inspired of God, it's perfectly fine to put forward a bunch of evidence that seems to increase the probability that that's true. But when we're looking at a proposition like that, we have to look at the total picture. We can't ignore certain pieces of evidence, like, say, the freshly brewed cup of tea, in favor of a whole bunch of other evidence that really should be overruled by something else, is kind of what I'm. So I just think that's something good to keep in mind as we. And this is just useful for all sorts of type of things in life where someone's like, how do you explain this, right? This can be useful for conspiratorial thinking too, right? If someone says, but let me show you all these reasons why the government is in cahoots on this or that,
Well, if I can chime in here too, it reminds me throughout the debate when Hansen would bring up certain things about the Book of Mormon being archaeologically verified or having some impressive facts about it. Like the use of like Hebrew names or something like that. And then Hansen would say, explain that, when I think Horn would sometimes be talking about a different point or a point that I thought was quite damning. But it's like, no matter how impressive this might be over here, the pieces of evidence that Hansen brought up, if let's say this one damning point, whatever it might be, holds through, then it just goes through. And the other things, we'll have to explain that in a different way. Right. So I think this might be, I'm suspecting what you're getting at.
It is. Yeah.
Right.
That's the basic principle. Right. And so I'm not saying that that's of necessity true of the Book of Mormon, but it is a true principle that one should keep in mind when evaluating any proposition, right? Including, like, say, the proposition of the resurrection. And we'll talk about this in a minute. But, if a philosophical atheist, materialist, believes that it is that miracles are metaphysically impossible, as long as they hold that belief, they really shouldn't accept that the resurrection occurred, because it is clearly a miracle, right? And it would be incumbent on the Christian to help them see why miracles are not only metaphysically possible, but perhaps even metaphysically expected, based on God's existence and his desire to help us see that he exists and that sort of thing, which would help them overcome that barrier. Yeah. Okay. So why then do we believe in some claims of revelation and not others? How does this all relate to faith? Okay. So I've got this definition of faith from the Catholic Encyclopedia, which I think is a really good one that I like from a Catholic perspective. There's many in the Catechism too. The Catechism is famous in my mind for defining every term 3 different times in different ways, because it's trying to just get everything in. The Catholic Encyclopedia says, faith is the assent of the intellect to a truth, which it accepts under the influence of the will, moved by grace. So what does that mean? We have to talk about this intellect and will very briefly. The intellect is a faculty of your soul, which enables humans to know and understand and reason. So I think everyone knows that humans have this innate ability to know things, understand things, and reason about things. Traditionally, we refer to that, we kind of group those together and refer to that as the intellect. Now, you also, as a human, have a faculty of your soul to choose and to recognize what is good. And we call that the will. Okay. So when we say that faith is an assent of the intellect, what we mean is that when we have faith, we are saying, I believe, right? I think this is true. I accept these things. But we accept it under the influence of the will. So it is not merely, faith is not simply the collection of evidences and then a mere intellectual conclusion, right? We don't we don't come to faith in the same way that we come to knowledge of mathematics, for instance, right? We accept under the influence of the will. So there's choice involved in this movement of the intellect, and it is moved by grace. Okay, so as Catholics, we believe very strongly that that the will and the intellect are both moved by grace to do this acceptance. So we cannot say, oh, I came to faith under my own power because I'm so amazing or because I'm inherently good or whatever. Grace has moved us. God infuses in us this preparatory grace that moves us to faith in him. And but the movement of the will is not arbitrary. Okay. And that's also that's dogmatic in Catholic belief, that the movement of faith is not, that's called fideism, which is the idea that the movement of the will and the intellect is just completely arbitrary. It's like, well, I can just, if the will is involved, then obviously I can just choose anything. I can just have faith in this or that or any claim. They're all equal because it's just merely arbitrary based on what each person desires. That's to say that the will is involved is not to say that it's an arbitrary choice, but merely to say that there is a recognition, there's sort of a hump that must be overcome by the will in order for the intellect to assent. And in Catholic terms, we refer to these as the motives of credibility. So God provides external signs to help us know that he is speaking, right? To show to us that he's speaking. And these are things like miracles, fulfilled prophecy, extreme holiness, stability in faith. Many of these are listed in the Catechism, and there's great works by Garrigou-Lagrange and things like that, and others who have really spoken on these motives of credibility really eloquently. Basically about how God does not desire our assent to simply be arbitrary or blind, but to be totally consistent with reason. So here I want to make an analogy to love, because I think about this a lot. I say here the act of faith is less like studying for a test and more like falling in love. I think most people have the experience of falling in love with someone, even if it's like a kind of childhood love, right? But when love gets serious, when two people are falling in love for each other, we can all recognize that some movements to love are rational and some are irrational, right? We are predisposed as humans to love. In a similar way that our intellect is predisposed to accept truths, and our will is predisposed to seek after the good. But not every movement toward love should be assented to, right? You might have someone, it's the I always think about the Little Mermaid, when Ariel, her dad is trying to stop her from falling in love with the human, and she says, "I'm 16 years old. I'm not a child," right? We all know that there are some movements towards love that are irrational, that someone should put a stop to it, to their own inner movements toward love. And there are also some that are totally consistent with reason. You don't love you don't love someone because they turn out to be a truth teller or because they turn out to be honest. You love them because they are beloved, because you recognize their goodness and their beauty. But if you were to find out that that they had been telling you lies, it would be irrational to continue to love them, right? Or to even advance in love with them. In much the same way as faith. We can be moved toward faith in many different ways and moved by God's grace toward faith. And we don't believe because it all makes sense to us intellectually. That's not the cause of our belief, or even this thing that sustains our belief. We're not like, oh, I believe in the Catholic faith just because it's a logical proposition and I worked it all out and that's why I believe. If that is why someone believes, then they do not have the kind of faith the church says we ought to have. We believe based on the movement of our soul toward the good that we recognize in the faith, consistent with our reason and our intellect. So I hope that all kind of makes sense. Do you have any comments on that or any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get us too far off track here, but I do think you're right that there is an element of the will that goes into faith, and that just this idea that I've known some people have, that I can just reason my way through everything, even to the Christian faith, It's sort of like, no, at a certain point, like God has to become this external reality to you that you trust, that you depend upon, that you love. You don't know the future, you don't know what might come, but you rely upon him as you would anybody else, right? And so this aspect of just kind of, okay, I have these static logical propositions here and I'm just going to, freeze them here in place, when faith is much more dynamic, it's living, it's ongoing. uh, that always concerns me, right? When I see somebody with that kind of faith or that kind of belief, because
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, then the moment that, I don't know, the Pope says something you don't like, or the moment that you have a situation that occurs in your life, that shakes your faith, then it's just going to fall apart immediately, right?
Yep. Yes.
Right. So, I mean, those are just some thoughts there. And I'm interested, getting into now the arguments for
Yeah.
Mormonism, because Jacob asked this question to like Trent, like, why do you believe the Bible's inspired, or why do you believe XYZ? So
Yes.
maybe we can get into that.
Yeah. So I just want to review briefly like Jacob's argument for the Book of Mormon. This is as kind of best as I can break it down, very high level. He's basically saying if the Book of Mormon is truly an ancient text, it's miraculous. In many different ways, he tries to argue the Book of Mormon is a kind of miracle, right? It can't be explained by Joseph Smith. It couldn't have come from him. And if it's miraculous, then it's inspired. And then he argues that the Book of Mormon is an ancient text. Therefore, the Book of Mormon is inspired scripture. There's a few other arguments that he puts forward, like he talks about the kind of the effect that the Book of Mormon has on people and things like that. And so you could reformulate this a little, sort of like, if the Book of Mormon bears all these fruits in people's lives, it must be inspired, that sort of thing. Most of the evidences he gives during the debate are meant to prove this one C here, right? The Book of Mormon is an ancient text. And kind of using that with the implication that, like, if one of these things ends up being correct, if we can prove that it's ancient, the only conclusion is that it's inspired. So there was a little bit of a disconnect, I think, in the debate, because the two sides, Horn and Hansen, were coming from a different approach of what it meant to be inspired, right? It's not merely sort of like, it has like these good effects on people, or it does these good things. Trent mentions, talks about this briefly, but the basic Catholic argument for biblical inspiration is Jesus and the Catholic Church are authorities from God. These authorities declare the Bible to be inspired. Therefore, the Bible's inspired scripture. There's nothing in the argument that sort of depends on the Bible being a certain type of historical record, like, literal history that can be proved in every single part, or that every portion of the Bible has a certain effect on people, like, every single book in the Bible really moves me or doesn't move me. The Bible is a big and complicated book. And the church's arguments for inspiration don't come from a sort of internal evidence from the text, but from the fact that Jesus is the authoritative Son of God. The church is the authoritative inheritor of Jesus's authority, and Jesus and the church have declared these scriptures to be inspired. So, let me see. I have to remember okay. So I kind of put here, like, what are the main questions then? Kind of based on the things that we've reviewed so far.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Book of Mormon a credible object of faith? Right? Is Joseph Smith a credible authority? If we think about faith as this movement of the intellect inspired by the will, are these credible objects that we should cooperate in faith with, or that we should resist? And then just a kind of basic question is, are these true authorities and revelations of Jesus Christ as we kind of move forward? Because as Catholics, and I know as Latter-day Saints, that's kind of the fundamental question that people are interested in. Most Latter-day Saints, I think, would say, if it weren't a true revelation of Jesus Christ, then they wouldn't believe in it. But they do believe that it is. And so I'm not trying to disparage them with this. I'm just saying that we have a commonality there, that we're seeking after the truth of Christ. Okay, so let's get into the Book of Mormon. So just a very brief introduction. The Book of Mormon is a book of sacred scripture to the Latter-day Saints. It was published in 1830 by Joseph Smith in upstate New York. It tells the story of multiple civilizations that travel by boat or by ship from the Old World to the Americas. It spans more than 1,000 years of civilization history, and it mainly focuses on a single family. There's a brief interlude near the end of the book that kind of jumps back and tells the story of a totally separate civilization that came many thousands of years even before the main story. But it mainly focuses on the family of a man called Lehi, who left Jerusalem in 600 BC, just before the Babylonian captivity, and his family who came to the Americas, and his descendants ended up splitting into two groups called the Nephites and the Lamanites. Okay. Lehi had several sons. One son was named Nephi, one son was named Laman, and they're kind of split, and their descendants end up being the two main groups. They're kind of like and mostly antagonists throughout the Book of Mormon, fighting against each other and that sort of thing. So I included here actually this picture of Joseph Smith, just because this is kind of fun and interesting. Very recently, this is the only known photograph of Joseph Smith, and it was discovered just like in the last year. So it's pretty certain that it is Joseph Smith, based on paintings of him that were done around this time, and certain features of his face that are kind of unique and match up. But it's just kind of neat to see this kind of very important historical figure in the United States, that we do have actually one of the earliest photographs. It would have been taken in the early 1840s, so very, very old. I forgot to mention, I have a picture of the gold plates here. Joseph Smith said that he was led by an angel to a hill near his home, and in that hill were buried a set of gold plates bound with rings that contained the record. And he translated these gold plates into the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. That's kind of the basic story. So let's get into some of the specific claims that Jacob made. I want to first talk about one. I think it might have been the first thing that Jacob brought up in his opening statement, which is this place called Nahom, and just kind of Arabian archaeology in general. So Jacob said that in the 1990s, the German Archaeological Institute discovered a place called Nahom in Southwest Arabia. So the Book of Mormon, and I'll show you a map on the next slide so we can kind of tie this together. The Book of Mormon, at the very beginning of the book, describes Lehi and his family leaving Jerusalem, and they travel immediately south across the Arabian Peninsula. And then from there, on the seas of the Arabian Peninsula, they build ships and sail to the Americas. But during this journey, they stop at a place which the Book of Mormon calls Nahom. It would be in the southwest portion of the Arabian Peninsula, based on the descriptions of the Book of Mormon. And then from there, they travel eastward to the sea. Okay, so here's a basic map that I think has been put out by an LDS apologist that kind of shows the basic idea of what we're talking about here, right? Bountiful is the name of the place where they stay by the seashore and where they build their ships so that they can cross the ocean to the Americas. And so Jacob claims that in the 1990s, the Book of Mormon says, right about here is a place that should be called Nahom, and we found it in the 1990s. They found an altar. Let me see what I say here. Yeah, okay, so in the 1990s, there was a temple excavated in that spot, around that spot, and they found altars bearing the inscription NHM. And if you're familiar with Semitic languages and ancient languages, they didn't have vowels, right? So Nahom, whatever, like that's pretty good, right? That seems to correspond to the Nahom. And like I said, it's roughly in the right spot. You know, you can quibble. Some people, the Book of Mormon describes that it should be in the borders by the sea. So some people have kind of said, no, Nahom should be like right here. This is too far inland, but like, you know, it's vaguely in the right area. So the question is this a discovery of a new place predicted by the Book of Mormon that has to be a miracle, right? To kind of strengthen his case. Like, if the book's ancient, is this an authentic thing that proves the Book of Mormon's ancientness? So I will say no. And I'll tell you why. Because this area of Yemen is the home of the Neem tribe and always has been for as far back as people know. Not only that, but this has been known in the West by this name for hundreds of years with various spellings. And many maps from the early 1800s show Arabia with this place printed on it. So Jacob's basic statement that this place was discovered in the 1990s is false. There were the temple was excavated in the 90s, and the altars with the inscription on it were discovered. But it is not surprising that altars with these inscriptions are found in a place with the sort of known name if that makes sense, of the place. It's not like we didn't know that this place was called Nahom and now we do. It just was always called NHM, right? Today it's usually transliterated with like Neem for the tribe there. I don't know how they would pronounce it in the local language there. So here's an example of one of these maps. This is printed in the year 1804. Remember, the Book of Mormon was printed in 1830. It's a very large map of Arabia, Egypt, the Red Sea, etc. And this was made by John Carey, a London engraver. So yeah, it's 25 years before the Book of Mormon. And it clearly shows a place called Nahom, exactly where the Book of Mormon says that it will be. So I got to zoom in here, right? So you can clearly see the places listed there. So how would an LDS person respond to this, right? Because, you know, it seems on the face of it, this is just like this would just be so great if you had this prediction, then a discovery, something that there's just no way he would have known. And that is sort of what they try to argue. They just say there's just no way that Joseph Smith would have seen one of these maps or known about this place. He came from a poor farming family. He was busy. His family worked for their food. How could he's not like he's going to New York City to consult libraries or museums to see these large, kind of the latest maps of these faraway places. And the truth is, and so often they will say something, they'll kind of make a joke out of it and be like, oh, you know, that Joseph Smith, LDS critics think that Joseph Smith spent all of his time reading books in libraries and studying all this stuff, right? And the truth is, I don't have a sort of specific explanation for how Joseph Smith would have come to know about this place. He doesn't ever write in his journal. He didn't keep a journal before he started to really get involved in the Book of Mormon project, as far as we know. But there's no smoking gun where he's like, oh, I was looking at this map of Arabia, right? But I'm going to put forward just like a very simple argument, which is this. A correct prediction cannot be evidence that a book is miraculous if the content of that prediction can be shown to be known when the book is published, okay? Unless you can prove it's impossible for the author to have known it, okay? So if it was just something, it is just simply true that at the time the Book of Mormon was written, it was known, maybe not generally, I'm not saying everyone knew this. It's not like people were talking about this in the marketplace on a Wednesday, but it was known that this place existed in that spot with this name, Nahom. And so in order to claim that its presence in a book from that time period in which it was known is a miracle, I think the burden of proof is shifted back on the person making that claim, that you would have to show that it is not possible for that person to have known it because it was just knowable. It just was knowable. And there's just, we pick up all sorts of weird bits of information as we're growing up. So I just want to make it really clear. I'm not claiming Joseph Smith saw this map. Okay. I don't know what he saw. We don't have every single book or printed object that even survived from that time period. So I don't know if he could have grabbed a book at some point on the mysteries of Arabia and just flipped through it. And it could have had a map in the back with the place named and it caught his eye for some reason. Right. But yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Two things. One is that, like, I know that even Trent Horn mentioned that he could have gone to like a public library, right, and maybe found this information. I don't know if that's a plausible alternate explanation. I want to get your thoughts on that. The other thing, maybe let's just go with that question first. Like, I mean, public library, could that have been a possible way that he found out about these things?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't know what kind of public libraries were available.
Sure.
In the time and place that he lived, right? But we know in general that Joseph. So we have a really good track of his movements and his activities once he gets close to the publication of the Book of Mormon, right? And one of the things that we learn about him very quickly is that he's very studious. He reads a lot of books. He has an extensive library. Now, we don't have an evidence of what his library was like prior to writing the Book of Mormon, right? And there is a quote from a late reminiscence from his mother that says something like, of all my children, Joseph Smith was one of the least likely to sit down and read a book or something like that, right? So we don't know. I don't have like a specific but I honestly don't think that I have the burden to even provide a specific hypothesis of how he would have come across this information, simply because, I mean, he could have had someone just mention it to him one time,
Exactly.
right?
Mhm.
I'll just kind of go back to what I said, and this will come into play later as we review some of the other evidences, which is like, if something just was known at the time this came out, unless you can show it was impossible for Joseph Smith or for whoever you want to claim the author of the Book of Mormon is to have known it, to use that as a claim like it must be a miracle just doesn't hold any water. There's
Mhm.
just a myriad of ways. I mean, I'm constantly saying things to my wife, and she'll say, how do you know that? And I'll say, I don't even know. I don't even know when I heard this. It's just a thing that I heard once, right?
Mhm.
And it turns out to be true. I heard it correctly.
Yeah, I did also feel that the him Hansen trying to shift the burden of proof on Trent to show how exactly, Joseph Smith knew about these things, when we can already show at the time,
Yeah,
was it the translation of Enoch was available, antiquities, Josephus's
yeah,
antiquities were available. I mean, I don't know if I don't think that Trent had to show, oh yeah, here is, Joseph Smith's library card, and on the library card we can see, I don't know, on the receipt on the back of this book and whatever. I don't think we have to go that far,
yeah.
right? I think it kind of takes out the
And
luster.
we know
Yeah.
that shortly after this time period, Joseph did have Josephus's antiquities,
Yeah.
right? It's just a question of, did he have it at this time, for instance, right? We
Hmm.
know at some point he did have that, because we have records of like what kind of books he owned and things. And
Mhm.
this will come in. You asked what are the chances that he would know it. When we get to discussion of chiasmus, I think that it will
Mm.
be we'll have something surprising there. People have this
Oh,
general
okay.
idea that Joseph lived in upstate New York in a
Mhm.
small city called Palmyra. He lived on a farm outside that city, right? And we have this general idea that, everyone up there was just a country bumpkin, right? They didn't have any books. They didn't know anything. They just
Yeah.
worked the land and sang songs and went to bed, right? And you're going to see that certain works, even of scholarship, have a surprising ability to arrive in remote locations. I guess
Mhm.
that's my teaser for when we get to chiasmus. So,
Yeah.
okay, now I do want to mention this. Let's go back to. I'm going to go back to the map real quick. So the Book of Mormon describes that after they get to Nahom, they turn east, and when they get to the seashore, they get to a land called Bountiful, and that they call Bountiful because it's full of trees and fruit and timber and things like that, right? And water and all that. And that is true. Okay. So the Dhofar region is in roughly the correct location. It is basically a correct prediction. And I will say that I think this is, for what it's worth, evidence in favor of the Book of Mormon. As far as I can tell, it wasn't widely known that this region was a desert oasis in the time and place that Joseph Smith lived. Could have been, I don't know, right? But it doesn't list on maps like lush land here, right?
Mhm.
And so it's not to say that there's nothing in the Book of Mormon that surprises us. However, on this one, I will just say that I think predicting a desert oasis correctly is not very strong evidence in my mind, because desert oases are something that we know do exist. And they often exist on the seashore because that's where river deltas occur and where water flows into the sea. Like in Egypt, for instance, right, where the Nile flows into the sea is an incredibly lush land. Whereas in Upper Egypt, south of that, it's very deserty and not lush at all. So, I'll give a point there and say,
Mhm.
I'm not trying to come out and say every single thing that Jacob said is false or can easily be explained just by looking at the historical evidence.
Mhm.
But the most specific thing here, he gave the impression in the debate that the Book of Mormon predicted this land Nahom. It was something totally unknown to the world, discovered in the 90s. Look at that. It's a bullseye prediction. How could that be unless he were a prophet of God?
Mhm.
And the truth is that it was a known place. It's always been known by that name. And it was even listed on maps in Joseph Smith's time, even well before his time, with that name. So,
And you're saying, just to go back to the previous slide, that the situation with Bountiful is different, though,
situation with
because
Bountiful, as far as
yeah,
I can tell, that I'm saying that
it's
is
different.
different.
Mhm.
Yes. That one I would concede, readily concede, is an accurate prediction that
Right.
there is a lush oasis on the southeastern coast of Yemen, or maybe it's in Oman. I'm not My modern Arabian geography, I'm not,
Yeah, but and you're also saying when you say that it's evidence, you're not saying that it's a slam dunk. It confirms everything. Of course not.
No, this goes back to what I said at the beginning. Evidence is just anything which, if true, changes the probability of it being true. Yeah. Right. So, if you're if you have all these scales and you're kind of weighing one side or the other, and you're getting to the Dhofar region, you can plop a little weight in favor of the Book of Mormon side of the scale.
Sure.
Right.
And the last thing I'll say too is just that, as you pointed out, predicting a desert oasis is not strong evidence since they're known to exist in deserts, right?
Yes.
It kind of reminds me of I forget where this is from, but well, I'll give you a real life example. Bob Jones was known to be, for the most part, a fraud. But there's this, I forget which historian it is. I think whichever one, he wrote a biography of Bob Jones. And he did say or admit that at least 2 of his miracles he couldn't explain. Right now, somebody could say, "Oh, well, there you go, Bob Jones. He's a pro." It's like, well, no. Okay, you have 2 here that are seemingly miraculous, right? But given the track record of everything else, we can just kind of throw up our hands, or we can say maybe there is some naturalistic explanation here that we don't know about quite yet.
Yep.
Right. But at least here you have something that looks impressive, right? And so you charitably count it as evidence, or just to be fair, you count it as evidence, right?
That's right.
But this is not the ultimate final analysis, of course.
Yeah, so, it's not proof. It's not determinative in any way. And like I said, I wouldn't put, if I'm using that scale analogy, I don't think this counts as like a large boulder that you put on weight in favor of the Book of Mormon. It's something small, but it goes on that side.
Sure, it counts. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's talk about Mulek. So Jacob said, the Book of Mormon says that King Zedekiah had a son named Mulek, and this was undiscovered until the 20th century. Okay, again, that sounds quite impressive. So let's give a little context. So as I mentioned, the main group of people the Book of Mormon covers is a family is Lehi and his family. They come over to the Americas. They live here for hundreds of years, if I have my timeline correctly in the story. After hundreds of years, a group of Nephites travels to a different part of the land, and there they encounter a group of people that they had not known before, different group of people. And this group of people say that they are descended from a man named Mulek, who was the son of King Zedekiah, who God led. It had a very similar story to Lehi. Just like Lehi, Mulek was led out of the wilderness or out of Jerusalem and sailed over to America. And now these 2 groups kind of come in contact with each other in the Book of Mormon. And so the question is, who is this Mulek, and is he a historical figure, right? That sort of thing. So what Jacob wants to say is, the Book of Mormon says that there's this Mulek who would be the son of King Zedekiah, but we didn't know about this at the time, and now we've discovered that King Zedekiah did have a son named Mulek. Okay, so let's look at just some of the context. I kind of mentioned this thing here. The first just kind of fits in the Book of Mormon narrative. So there was a man named, and Trent mentions this in the debate, Malkiyahu, the son of the king, who is mentioned in the Bible, and that's really important. This person, it's not like this person was discovered by archaeology. This person is mentioned in the Bible multiple times in connection with King Zedekiah. And this person may have been a son of King Zedekiah. When it says son of the king, that could be a direct reference to Zedekiah. It might not be. And I kind of say this in a moment, but and not only that, but we have archaeologists have discovered a seal stamp, right, for like sealing letters and things like that, which may have belonged to the same man. So Malkiyahu, it's a name that means Yahweh is king, or the Lord is king, and it's an incredibly common Hebrew name. Okay, there are other Malkiyahus in the Old Testament as well, besides the one that's tied to King Zedekiah. So it's unclear whether this seal stamp belongs to the man who's mentioned in Jeremiah. Here's a picture of it. It just says on the stamp, belonging to Malkiyahu, son of the king. Or in Hebrew, that would be Malkiyahu ben Melech. So I feel like Jacob misrepresents the scholarship a little on Malkiyahu. There's not a scholarly consensus that this Malkiyahu was definitely like a biological son of the king. It describes in other places that the sons of King Zedekiah were killed by the Babylonians when they sacked Jerusalem and carried them away. They didn't want to leave the royal line behind, right, around, so that they could be challenged later. And the Book of Mormon would claim that this Mulek, being Zedekiah's son, would have been led away, by God or something before this happened so that he was safe. It's not totally impossible. But like I said, it's not certain that this person even was the son of Zedekiah. The scholarship's not like, oh, we discovered that. And Jacob also says, did you know that the short form of the name Malkiyahu is Mulek? And that is not supported by any evidence whatsoever. The best you can get is a kind of inference or sort of speculation that it would be. So I have a quote here from Dr. David Rolfe Seeley, who's a scholar at BYU. I got this quote from a website of an LDS apologist named Jeff Lindsay. So I'm just trying to source where I got things, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the quote. It says, "It is certainly possible Mulek comes from or is related to the biblical name Malkiyahu, but this relationship cannot be explained by any known rules or parallels from comparative Semitics. In support of this relationship, there are many attested phonological shifts in Semitic languages that we can't explain, but the shift from Malkiyahu to Mulek is only hypothetical at this point, since it is not attested in Semitic languages. Until further documentation, it remains as a tantalizing possibility which cannot be proved." So it is just simply false to say, did you know the short form of that name is Mulek? They certainly have, like I mentioned, in Semitic languages, you don't have vowels, right? So Malkiyahu would be something like MLKJH, right? And Mulek would be MLK. Well, those are similar, right? And one is certainly shorter with like the end chopped off, right? But it's just not correct to say that like Samuel, don't you know the short name is Sam? Malkiyahu, don't you know the short name is Mulek? As though it's like this direct hit. And there are plenty of alternative explanations for how we would get even that kind of close similarity between Mulek and Malkiyahu. So, for instance, the man, as I mentioned, is mentioned in the Bible multiple times in the book of Jeremiah. In the King James, it's translated as Malchiah, son of Ha-melech, which is not a great translation because it should be Malchiah, son of the king. Ha-melech is Hebrew for the king. And so that's, in fact, even in the Hebrew, that Ham is not there. That's actually something added by the translators. That's like the definite article, I think, in Hebrew. And so I think in Hebrew, it just says Malkiyahu ben Melech, son of king, right? And when he's mentioned, he's often mentioned next to a man named Ebed Melech, which means servant of the king, right? And these things are transliterated into the King James. The Hebrew of the name I mentioned here is Malkiyahu ben Melech. And you can kind of see, I don't know if you can see where I'm going here, but like you've got the name Joseph associates someone with King Zedekiah he calls Mulek. But in the King James version of the Bible with which Joseph Smith was very familiar, you have all these Melech names mentioned in connection with King Zedekiah. So it really could be as simple as saying that Joseph took names that were associated with Zedekiah in the Bible and used them to invent the name Mulek, right? It's utterly plausible, just this idea, because so many names with MLK consonants are related to King Zedekiah. It could also just be a coincidence. I'm going to mention this. Where do I mention this? I mentioned this on the next slide, so I'll actually mention it here. In terms of naming coincidences, some people think like, well, I don't know, that's too much of a coincidence to be true. And I will mention an example that is very relevant to Mormonism. So the Book of Mormon, at the very end of the book, there's a sort of climactic final battle between the Nephites and the Lamanites. And in this battle, it takes place on a hill called the Hill Cumorah. This is very important, the name of that hill, Cumorah. And at the end of this battle, every Nephite is killed except for one remaining Nephite named Moroni. And this Moroni is the one who Joseph Smith said buried the plates and is the same angel that appeared to lead Joseph Smith to the plates. This hill Cumorah is the hill that Joseph Smith went and got the plates from near his house. Joseph Smith said, this is that hill, Cumorah, right? So you have this Cumorah, you have Moroni, right? very important parts, especially in the early times of Joseph Smith's experience telling people about the Book of Mormon. He's like, there's this hill, Cumorah, and Moroni, right? Moroni is this angel. That's how the story gets told. Well, it turns out that there is a place. There's a man named Captain Kidd. You can look him up. I think his name was William Kidd. He was a Scottish privateer in the 1700s who like explored the world and sailed all over the place. And the adventures of Captain Kidd were very popular in the Americas at this time when Joseph Smith was young. And we even have a reminiscence from someone who knew Joseph Smith at this time, who said that Joseph was obsessed with Captain Kidd. And Captain Kidd visited some islands that were called the Comoros Islands. And the main settlement of that island is called Moroni. Okay. And now I'm just going to say, I think this is a coincidence. It is very unlikely. Moroni at that time would have been like the tiniest settlement in the world. There's no evidence that that word ever appears in print with Comoros. Even to this day, you can look it up. The Comoros Islands, the capital is called Moroni, or there's like a city called Moroni on them. Very unlikely that if Joseph Smith had read a story of Captain Kidd, that it would have paired these names together, right? But it's one heck of a coincidence. And so either we reject naming coincidences and we say, no. If there's a naming similarity, like it means something, in which case that would kind of be bad for the Comoros connection in terms of believing the Book of Mormon narrative. Or we can admit that sometimes even unexpected naming coincidences can occur, especially when you're giving many, many, many character names throughout, like, say, a book. So this is kind of like my, if you want to know my opinion, I think the most likely thing is kind of what I outlined here, is that Joseph Smith, knowing the Bible quite well, being a student of the Old Testament, was familiar with this Malchiah or this Ebed Melech. And when he's coming up with a name, he comes up with the name Mulek. So just in summary on this portion, when Jacob says, here, like the Book of Mormon says there's a son named Mulek, and this was undiscovered till the 20th century. That's not quite true. We've always known who this Malchiyahu character is. It's just in the Bible. Like, it's just right there. And we found a seal in the 20th century, but again, there's nothing new really there in terms of the seal. But the seal is new, but this person is still just the person mentioned there. And you can't say that Mulek just is the short form of that name, Bullseye, that type of thing. Do you have any thoughts or questions about that?
So, going back to your Captain Kidd point, because I think that the stuff that you said before, especially citing that Brigham Young scholar, I thought that was like pretty damning, that you can't just assume that Mulek is the short form of the Malchiyahu name. Was your point with the Captain Kidd story that you have the name, I think, Cumorah, right, in the story, and there happens to be an actual place by that name, and it has a town called Moroni? Or could you go into what you were getting?
Yeah, let me explain that again. So Captain Kidd was like I said, Scottish privateer in the 1700s. Real guy. Okay. He sailed all over the world for the British, taking over French ships and other, you know what I mean, doing all the privateer kind of stuff. And he was kind of a folk hero. And so people would write stories about the adventures of Captain Kidd. People growing up in this time, like in the early 1800s, just loved the guy. There were all these rumors that he'd landed in different places and had buried treasure, right? Yeah. And so people were always like, oh, there's a Captain Kidd treasure over here. Let's go find it, right? So these stories were just like in the air, and there were printed accounts saying that about the adventures of Captain Kidd. In some of these printed accounts, Captain Kidd visits a place called the Comoros Islands.
Comoros, okay.
Okay. And in the Comoros Islands, one of the chief settlements is a place called Moroni.
Right.
These names are strikingly similar to major names, very, very important names in the Book of Mormon. The hill Cumorah, which is where the gold plates were found, and the angel Moroni, which was the angel that led Joseph Smith to the plates. Okay.
And are you saying that you're not, but you were saying though that like it's not likely that Cumorah and Moroni were mentioned in a Captain Kidd story,
So we know that the Comoros Islands were mentioned in
right?
Captain Kidd stories. I don't think Moroni ever was, as
I see.
far as I know, right?
Hmm.
I am not a scholar that has studied all of the Captain Kidd stories that were in circulation at that time.
Hmm.
But we know the Comoros Islands were, and we know that the settlement on the Comoros Islands is Moroni. And we also have someone who knew Joseph Smith from this time period who wrote that Joseph was obsessed with Captain Kidd stories.
Mm.
Okay. So all of this is like a very intriguing connection. So, so it's very tempting. In fact, many, some LDS critics will say this is clearly where Joseph Smith got the names Cumorah and Moroni. He kind of got them from this Captain Kidd story. Now, I'm pointing out, I personally don't think that's right.
Hmm.
I think this is just a coincidence. But I'm using this to illustrate that naming coincidences are things that just happen sometimes,
Okay.
right? That's kind of what I'm saying. So if you have an LDS person who wants to say, no, there are no naming coincidences, right? This can't be a coincidence. Look how similar it is.
I see.
Then you kind of have to bite the bullet and say, well, this is even more similar, like way more similar, right? And so now it's looking bad for Joseph Smith if you reject naming coincidences. But I think what we clearly are in a case of, like, you sometimes just have to accept naming coincidences, even ones that are like, what are the chances, right? Like, I don't know, weird coincidences happen all the time. And so I think that this is a coincidence. And this is kind of like Jacob says, so like talking about Book of Mormon names, he says, the Book of Mormon contains over a dozen undiscovered authentic Hebrew names, right? Now, some of these names that Jacob mentioned, I don't know why he would mention, like he specifically mentions Chemish, which is a Book of Mormon character, and says that's an undiscovered Hebrew name. But Chemish with an O is a character in the Bible, frequently mentioned. It's a Moab, it's the god of the Moabites, that very evil god that the Moabites, I think, sacrifice their children to and that sort of thing, right? So to say that Chemish is an undiscovered Hebrew name just isn't true. I mean, it has like an exact biblical parallel. And so it's not weird to have that. Other names, I mean, I didn't write down the full list of all the names he mentioned, and it's very possible that some of them have similarities. I hope, though, with like the kind of Mulek and Malkiyahu example, you can kind of see the types of parallelisms that LDS apologists often use to kind of justify, like, this was an undiscovered Hebrew name, but they're often no better than the one we just reviewed, right? Where it's like kind of similar a little bit if you squint a little bit, and if you kind of assume that there are unknown phonological shifts in languages, then sure, it could be, right? And some of them I think would just be coincidence. If you're just throwing, if you've read a lot of the Old Testament and you're just kind of putting together common Semitic sounds into new names, you're probably going to end up with a few that are accurate, that end up being real names that most people wouldn't have known were real names. That's kind of my thought on the names.
Yeah, and just like I've just noticed so far with I mean, I'm always going to go back to the Mulek example because I just think it's very damning, because here when he asked Trent that question, did you know that the shortened form is Mulek? He says it as if it's a fact, and he sounds so confident. And if nobody checked or knew any better, they would think, "Oh wow, like that's really impressive," right?
Yep.
And then here he just throws out over a dozen undiscovered authentic Hebrew names, and then the one that he does mention is just right in the Bible. It's like, wait, okay, so it seems as if so far he's been overselling his case big time.
Yep, I think that's accurate. My only correction I would say is Chemish is not the only one he names. He does name 5 or 6 or something like that. I just picked out that one because it was the one that jumped out at me as the most obvious overselling, right? Because I was like, how could he have Chemish in that list? Like, that's literally just in the Bible. Okay, let's talk chiasmus, because they spent a bit of time on this one as well. So Jacob said this: in 1967, textual scholars discovered dozens of chiasms in the Book of Mormon. So we'll discuss what a chiasmus is. LDS apologists do use this as one of the most common, and they say is one of the strongest textual evidences that the Book of Mormon is an authentic ancient text. So a chiasmus is a literary device, a poetic literary device that was very common in ancient Semitic literature. it's still common in much literature today. It's where you present ideas in a certain order and then repeat those same ideas in reverse order. Okay. So this is the one that Jacob quotes in the debate, and it's a very, very fine example of a tight chiasm. He who finds his life shall lose it. He who loses his life for my sake shall find it. So you have this kind of poetic flipping, right? So, and like I said, this was all over the Bible, both tight and longer chiasms. And Jacob says, they found a whole bunch of these chiasms in the Book of Mormon. So many LDS apologists, now Jacob does not explicitly say this, but if people study this topic, they will come across this many, many times. They will say that chiasmus as a literary device was not known in Joseph Smith's time, right? Sort of like, well, there's people in Joseph Smith's day hadn't recognized that chiasmus was a Semitic poetic device. So it's very surprising if we find chiasms in the Book of Mormon. But this is just not true. So chiasms were first detailed, I think, as far as I know. I mean, I know at least this. I think that our Anglican Bishop Robert Louth was first. In the 1700s, he discovered and first published in Latin that textual parallelism was an essential characteristic of the Hebrew Bible. And in this work, he specifically mentions multiple kinds of parallelism because there are many different kinds of parallelism that occur in the Old Testament. And chiasmus is just one of those. I can't remember the exact name that he gives for it. He doesn't call it chiasmus because that term hadn't been invented yet, but it's like a sort of reverse parallelism, right? There's kind of like parallelism where you present the things in the same order, but using different words. Isaiah does this all the time where he has couplets, right? Where he re-emphasizes, like, the law will come forth from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, right? Is one of the famous prophecies from Isaiah. I may have gotten those backwards, but there you have Zion and Jerusalem are synonyms for each other, and the law and the word of the Lord are synonyms. And this is a poetic restating. That's a parallelism, not a chiasm, because those are not in opposite order. Mm-hmm. And then a man named Thomas Hartwell Horne wrote a book, An Introduction to the Critical Study and Knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, which covered Louth's research in great detail. And this book was, honestly, it was like a runaway bestseller in the United States. It went through 3 editions. And, again, this is the type of thing you might think to yourself, okay, maybe scholars at this time knew that this kind of parallelism was a feature of Hebrew poetry, but there's no way that someone in like upstate New York would have known this, right? Oh, I have a quote. From Horne's book here. He says, "The grand and indeed the sole characteristic of Hebrew poetry is what Bishop Louth entitles parallelism, that is, a certain quality, resemblance, or relationship between the members of each period, so that in 2 lines, or members of the same period, things shall answer to things, and words to words, as if fitted to each other by a kind of rail or measure. This is the general strain of Hebrew poetry, instances of which occur in almost every part of the Old Testament." This was from his first edition in 1818. So, could Joseph have known about this? Yes. In fact, we know that the book was advertised in Joseph Smith's hometown in 1825, 5 years before the Book of Mormon was published. So I have a picture here of the newspaper itself, and this is, I think, a very illustrative example. I mentioned this when we were discussing this question of like, how could Joseph Smith have possibly seen, like, say, a map of Arabia? If we didn't have this newspaper article, I am sure that many people would say something like, how could someone like Joseph Smith have possibly... It's just unthinkable that this scholarly work by Horne would have made its way to this really small frontier town in Palmyra, New York. And yet, the Wayne Sentinel, I mean, Joseph Smith lived like a mile from this town. This was his town, right? This would have been the newspaper that would have been circulated. The Wayne Sentinel in 1825 published that E. Little, a bookseller, was selling the book, An Introduction to the Critical Study and Knowledge of the Holy Scriptures by Thomas Hartwell Horne. And then he describes it in great detail. I don't have the whole article, but he goes through and says, and even says, this is what's covered in the book: Hebrew poetry, parallelism, right? That type of thing. And this book discusses chiasmus in detail in the work. So I want to be very clear here. I'm not claiming necessarily that Joseph Smith bought and read this book, but I am saying that he lived in an area where people were buying and reading books of this type. And so it is not, enough so that a bookseller in this small town in New York thought it would be profitable to buy a bunch of these books and advertise their sale, right? So it is just not at all unreasonable to think that someone in Joseph Smith's position would be aware of this just being a feature of the ancient scriptures, right? And I'll make a very similar argument like I did with Nahom, which is we can't consider the precedence of Chiasmus miraculous if it was just generally available knowledge in Joseph Smith's time and place. Unless you can somehow, again, I would say then the burden then shifts back on the person who's claiming it is a miracle, that you have to show that it would be impossible for the author of this book or whatever work you're talking about to have known this. And I think that would be impossible to show, basically.
Yeah. And I mean, wow, this newspaper article, I mean, this is very close. I think this is almost like the prime evidence that, at least for somebody who's, let's say, skeptical of Mormonism, at least on this particular regard, would want to have, to show that, hey, it's in proximity. He could have had access to it, or he could have had access to it through other people. It's there. Yeah.
Or he could have heard it discussed at church service, right? Joseph Smith, we know, attended with his family these long revival meetings where preachers would preach for hours and hours and hours, right? And these were the kinds of things that people were on their minds. We have to shift the sort of way that the way we approach the world is extremely different from the way frontier Americans in the early 1800s approached the world. They were just absolutely, the entire culture was absolutely steeped in the Bible. And in Christianity, among other, other things, like they were into folk magic and things like that as well. But like this animated their whole world. There was no entertainment. There was no television, right? This is what they lived. And, so a lot of times we think to ourselves, oh, there's no way that he could have just like known this much about the scriptures or whatever. But it's just it was a totally different world back then. And there absolutely is a way that it could have happened. Okay, let's talk about the translation process. So Jacob says, Joseph Smith was able to write a 500-page book in a little over 2 months. And he says in one draft, right? It's very impressive. And I actually say, I think that is impressive. I think there are many elements of the Book of Mormon I will very much concede are impressive. So LDS apologists will frequently claim that the speed of the composition is evidence of it being miraculous. They'll often quote Joseph's wife, his first wife, Emma, and Jacob mentioned this quote quickly in the debate where she said, this was a late reminiscence near the very end of her life, 40 years later or something. She said, Joseph Smith could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. So could Joseph have produced the Book of Mormon? Like, is this even reasonable to think? So first, let's talk about that 2 months, a little over 2 months is what Jacob says. So Joseph finished the translation of the Book of Mormon in 1829, but he first began talking about it in 1823. So, and we have a quote from his mother, who, this is again a later reminiscence, but she was remembering back to this time period when Joseph had first started talking about the plates and the Book of Mormon, but long before he began translating it. She said, during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of travelings, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life among them. So Joseph had 6 years to think about and plan the Book of Mormon before he even began translating it at all. He also sort of had two tries at it. So he first translated 116 pages in 1828, and then those pages were lost. That's a long story, interesting history to look into. But the point is that he didn't then resume translation for a number of months, I think at least 6 months, before he started translating again. So not only was there kind of a 6-year gap, there was also kind of like a first go at things, and then that was all lost, and then he started afresh. And then in 1829, the remainder of the Book of Mormon was most likely dictated in between 65 and 90 days. Scholars will give different estimates. They've kind of poured over Joseph Smith's movements during this time. How many days would have been available to him to work, right? But let's just use the most conservative estimate, 65 days. Okay. So the Book of Mormon has about 270,000 words, a long book. Okay. If he dictated it over 65 working days, this was not 7 days a week for 65 days, right? The whole period took more than 65 days, but we know on some of those days, for instance, he was traveling. He's not dictating those days. Mm-hmm. It would be about 4,200 words per day. This is like the worst case scenario. Okay. At a dictation rate of about 20 words per minute, you could cover 4,200 words in about 3.5 hours of working time per day. And so it's a fairly brisk pace, but there's nothing superhuman about spending 3 to 4 hours a day, or even 5 to 6 hours a day in the 65 days that you've dedicated to this activity to finish the book. Okay. At least in terms of like, we're not talking like, oh, the math just doesn't add up. He would have had to, spend this much time, like 25 hours a day or whatever. And it doesn't even seem superhuman. There would have been plenty of time. In fact, we know that they would take breaks and walk out into the woods and skip stones in the pond and go on walks and pray and things like that, right? So there was also time for reflection, kind of like where you were and things like that. This is a letter. So the LDS apologists love to say that Joseph couldn't dictate a well-worded letter. We do happen to have a letter from Joseph Smith from 1829, the year the Book of Mormon was produced. I'm going to read this short paragraph, and you can tell me if it sounds like he was incapable of dictating or writing a well-worded letter. He said, "I would inform you that I arrived at home on Sunday morning, the 4th, after having a prosperous journey, and found all well. The people are all friendly to us except a few who are in opposition to everything, unless it is something that is exactly like themselves. And 2 of our most formidable prosecutors are now under censure and are cited to a trial in the church for crimes which, if true, are worse than all the gold book business. We do not rejoice in the affliction of our enemies, but we shall be glad to have truth prevail. There begins to be a great call for our books in this country. The minds of the people are very much excited when they find that there is a copyright obtained and that there is really a book about to be printed." So I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty well-worded letter. Seems pretty coherent. He uses long words correctly. It's pretty educated. He didn't have a lot of formal education, but it doesn't. I'm not saying it's high literature, but it's coherent. It's pretty good. Mm-hmm. It's actually a much better letter than most college graduates could write today, I would bet.
That's right.
So that's kind of my bit on the translation process. There are other things that apologists will bring up, like there's stories that Joseph Smith never asked where they had stopped the day before when he would resume translating and things like that. They'll also talk about sort of the complexity of the Book of Mormon's plot, which I will grant is quite complex, and it does fit together. It doesn't have like a bunch of internal contradictions where you can easily say like, oh, this is clearly like just a total contradiction with that. And I would say that these elements of the Book of Mormon are impressive, but there's nothing necessarily miraculous about someone composing a complicated book. Yeah. Or even doing it relatively quickly, right? Like it certainly is impressive. And after the Book of Mormon, Joseph's literary output remains very high. He produces many, many works of scripture, many letters, many books of history, right? And they're quite good. He seemed to be a very skilled communicator in many different venues and different media. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts going through my mind right now. I think one is that, like, I think people often cite, the mother example, or what the mother said about him not being, the most inclined to books, right? Yeah. And somebody might say, well, how do you explain that, right? Well, I mean, one, you bring up the letter here where you have somebody who can clearly write quite well. You also mentioned that he did have a book collection later in his life, right? A quite impressive one, Antiquities.
Very impressive. Yes.
So on and so forth. So then, it's funny. I'll give you an example from my life, right? My mom, she'll sometimes say, Swan, you're kind of lazy, right? And let's say that somebody just took that out of context and just got my mom saying that, right? And then they look and they see, oh, wow, Swan's studying at Harvard Divinity School. He's studying Koine Greek, and he's also writing multiple papers at the same time, right? there's clearly maybe a way or an angle from which my mom is seeing me that's different from, let's say, the whole expanse of everything I'm doing, right?
Yes.
And I'll admit, I'm lazy in the sense that I could do a better job of maybe, I don't know, cleaning my room, folding my laundry, right?
Yeah.
That's what she means by it, right? So in the case of like Joseph Smith and what his mom said there, I think you have to compare, okay, here's what mom says versus here's the actual evidence that we have. Maybe she's seeing it from a particular angle, right? As happens with moms and their children.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's talk about anachronisms now, because Trent pressed this point a number of times. So briefly, an anachronism is something that is out of place for the time in which they appear. And anachronisms can actually be very helpful to help us date when texts were written. So I say here, imagine a story about Abraham Lincoln with an iPhone. If such a story was written, you know that it's written post 2007, because that's when the first iPhone came out. Doesn't matter what the book claims, doesn't matter what it says. It would just be so obvious. It would be totally unreasonable for someone to say, well, maybe there just were iPhones back in this time, right? Like, for iPhones, we have such confidence that they appeared in 2007 that anything that mentions them was written after 2007, right? So the Book of Mormon has many anachronisms. Jacob claims that all of the anachronisms are what's called merely apparent anachronisms, not real ones. Or they have just been proven since not to be anachronisms after all. So they are potentially one of the biggest threats to the Book of Mormon in terms of an ancient text, because even if one anachronism ends up being real, that would show the Book of Mormon to be not an authentic ancient text. Like, you only need one. You kind of had gestured to that before. If you have one thing that goes through, that would prove, there's only one iPhone is needed in a text to prove that it's from 2007.
Mm-hmm.
So the Book of Mormon is filled with anachronisms that are acknowledged both by non-LDS and LDS people. Okay, there are horses, there are anachronistic animals mentioned, like horses, elephants, donkeys, cattle, and other domesticated livestock. There's anachronistic technology like chariots, steel, metal coinage that were not in the New World prior to Columbian contact. There's anachronistic theology, like there's fully developed atonement theology, extensive New Testament quotation. There's anti-universalism rhetoric, which was very popular at the time. It's just kind of filled with Protestant theology from the early 1800s. Joseph Smith's culture shows up, elements from the 19th century culture, such as revival worship, treasure digging, secret combinations. That's like a very specific phrase. The country at the time the Book of Mormon was published they were kind of at this like anti-Masonic fervor. It was like everyone was like freaked out by the Masons. They murdered a guy. It's a really fascinating story. His last name was Morgan, the person they killed, who had revealed Masonic secrets, and everyone was just saying like the Masons are taking over the government. And the Book of Mormon and they even used the phrase secret combinations all the time. And that phrase makes it into the Book of Mormon, and it's a major plot throughout much of the Book of Mormon about secret combinations taking over the government and that sort of thing. There's racism in the Book of Mormon that is very specific to the time and place of Joseph Smith. It talks about Native Americans being cursed with a skin of blackness for disobeying God. And then the Native American origins are also very much from the Joseph Smith time. So at the time the Book of Mormon was published, saying the Native Americans came from the Middle East was commonplace, including the idea that there was a sort of like civilized and savage society, there were two civilizations of natives. There was like a civilized and a savage one, and they fought battle with each other, right? There were even people who sort of theorized, because they were very racist back then, that the civilized people must have been light-skinned and the savage ones must have been dark-skinned. Okay. So I'm going to stay on this last one for a little bit to talk about anachronisms, because Jacob claims that the anachronisms have been decreasing with time. So this comes from there was an LDS apologist sometime in the late 20th century who put together a list. He's like, I'm going to make a list of all the things people have said are anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. And then he's like, and I'm going to show that throughout time, some of these things have been discovered. So the list is getting shorter. And then as time goes on, LDS apologists, with sometimes I think dubious logic, have sort of been like, look, more anachronisms are being shown not to be. And that's why he says they're decreasing over time. But the fundamental question is not, is there like a big list of anachronisms that's shrinking? It's just, as time passes, is the Book of Mormon more or less plausible as a historical record, right? And we're going to do a case study real quick with what's called the mound builder myth. Okay. So before I go to there, I'll explain what that is. The European settlers in the early Americas saw that there were many mounds and earthworks that had been built by the Native Americans when they arrived. So even when Joseph Smith, most of these are gone today because we have done such a good job of populating the Americas and paving everything for our, plowing everything for our roads, that sort of thing. But in Joseph Smith's time, you could hardly go anywhere without coming across a very impressive mound or earthenwork that were the remnants of some large advanced civilization that was no longer there. And in Joseph Smith's time, they looked around at the natives that were around them and would say things like, well, there's no way these, primitive people could have constructed all of these things. And so it was a common belief that some other group must have constructed all these earthenworks, some great civilization that had been destroyed by the Native Americans that were alive, that were there, that were among them. Okay. Does that kind of track? Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what's called the mound builder myth. They're like, oh, who were these mound builders? Who was this lost civilization that were killed by these savage Native Americans that we see today? Okay. Well, the Book of Mormon basically writes the mound builder myth into the text. So it tells the story, as I mentioned before, of the Nephites and the Lamanites. Both groups come from Jerusalem from a single family, but they split shortly after they arrive in the Americas. And it describes the Book of Mormon, the Nephites explicitly as like white and civilized, and the Lamanites are cursed with a dark skin and are lazy. And I'm going to read this, what I consider to be quite racist scripture from the Book of Mormon. So I'm just going to kind of apologize for that in advance. But I think it's very indicative of how the Book of Mormon kind of portrays these two groups. It says, "And God caused a cursing to come upon the Lamanites, yea, even a sore cursing because of their iniquity. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they became like unto a flint. Wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them. And thus saith the Lord God, I will cause that they shall be loathsome to thy people, save they shall repent of their iniquities. And cursed shall be the seed of him that mixeth with their seed, and they shall be cursed even with the same cursing. And the Lord spake it, and it was done. And because of their cursing, which was upon them, they did become an idle people, full of mischief and subtlety, and did seek in the wilderness for beasts of prey." So here you see like the basic outline of this mound builder myth, right? You're like, yeah, oh, the Native Americans are these more dark-skinned people, and they're going to end up having this great struggle, right? The Book of Mormon sort of becomes this great civilizational struggle between Nephites and the Lamanites. At times they reconcile with each other, but for the most part, and it ends with this great big battle. So I'm going to just read a couple quotes from this time period that show that this is just what everyone thought at the time the Book of Mormon was written. So here's in 1816, the Philadelphia Portfolio. This is not close to where Joseph Smith lived, but it's just it's in Philadelphia. It reported that, quote, "It is a very general opinion prevailing in the Western country that there is ample proof that the country in general was once inhabited by a civilized and agricultural people who were eventually destroyed by the Indians. It is a current opinion," the periodical continued, "that the first inhabitants of the Western country were white people. One Indian tradition reportedly held Kentucky had once been inhabited by white people, but that they were exterminated by the Indians. Yates and Moulton also argued that the mounds and fortifications had been constructed by a white race, which had been destroyed by the Indians in the Great Lakes region." And you can kind of just see, if you're at all familiar with the Book of Mormon, it's just totally obvious that this is the story of the Book of Mormon. This is from 1811, from Governor DeWitt Clinton in New York. He says, "There is every reason to believe that previous to the occupancy of this country by the progenitors of the present nations of Indians, it was inhabited by a race of men much more populous and much further advanced in civilization. The numerous remains of ancient fortifications which are found in this country demonstrates a population far exceeding that of the Indians when this country was first settled." And then finally, Trent mentions this book, View of the Hebrews, in the debate. And this book reveals that not only did people think that there were these two civilizations, but that many people thought that they came from Israel, right? Just like the Book of Mormon says. So here's this quote. It's a little bit long, but I think it's very important. Ethan Smith wrote this. He's not related to Joseph Smith. Says, Israel brought into this new continent a considerable degree of civilization, and the better part of them long labored to maintain it. But others fell into the hunting and consequent savage state, whose barbarous hordes invaded their more civilized brethren and eventually annihilated most of them, and all in these northern regions. But the savage tribes prevailed, and in time their savage jealousness and rage annihilated their more civilized brethren. It is highly probable that the more civilized part of the tribes of Israel, after they settled in America, became wholly separated from the hunting and savage tribes of their brethren, that the latter lost the knowledge of having descended from the same family with themselves, that the more civilized part continued for many centuries, that tremendous wars were frequent between them and their savage brethren, till the former became extinct. No other hypothesis occurs to mind, which appears by any means so probable. And that, again, this is the plot of the Book of Mormon. They split, they have wars, eventually the savage, quote unquote, Lamanites prevail over the Nephites. So, in summary, the more we learn about the Native Americans and the 19th century culture from which the Book of Mormon comes, the more clear it is that the Book of Mormon fits very well in its 19th century context. Things like the plot, the assumptions, the theology, they all sort of come from and engage with the context that it was written, right? This is my last slide on the Book of Mormon itself. So just comparing it to the Bible briefly, right? The Bible is a very different book from the Book of Mormon. It doesn't come from a single source, right? The Bible is a collection of many different books, which each have their own history. And sometimes that history is difficult to suss out from a scholarly point of view, but it's not like the Bible springs forth from like a single person at a single time and sort of makes all these claims about where it came from that are totally inconsistent with what we find from it. The story of the Bible is just different for every book that exists. But even for the oldest books of the Bible, we have explicit archaeological evidence that show that parts of the Bible are literal history. I'm not saying that like that therefore means every single line in the Bible is exact literal history, but we also know that it is rooted in a historical place and time and narrative, totally different from the Book of Mormon, which we have no real evidence of it being anchored in this way. It's also true that I think that the Christian faith is not dependent on any specific dating of Old Testament books. So Jacob brings up things like, what do you do with like anachronisms of Tubal-Cain in the book of Genesis? Well, I mean, I can tell you that I personally think that helps us date the book of Genesis, at least in how it sort of arrives at its final form. And I don't think that is at all threatening to Christian faith. Whereas I do think that if the Book of Mormon is shown not to be ancient, it is threatening to being a faithful Latter-day Saint. There are many LDS, not many. There are some LDS people who do believe in a non-historical Book of Mormon now because of all the evidence, and they still believe in the tradition broadly. So I'm not saying that's impossible, but I think that it is a different kind of threat to faith than you find with, questioning whether or not, like, at what time was Daniel written? Was it really written before the captivity or after the captivity, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So in short, I don't really think there's really any comparison between the Bible and the Book of Mormon, just as I kind of see the different things. But that kind of wraps up the Book of Mormon section, and then get into the Book of Mormon Witnesses.
Yeah, Isaac, I told the audience that they can start maybe asking any questions if they have any, and then I'll just kind of star them and record and like save them for later.
Okay, sounds great.
So yeah, if that's good with you, then I think obviously still listen to the presentation for those of you who are watching. But Isaac, keep going, and I will try to get the questions lined up for you when the time comes.
Sounds great. Okay, so let's talk about Book of Mormon Witnesses, because I think this is really important. And I'm just going to say up front that overall, I think that the Book of Mormon Witnesses, if I had to put them on one side of the scale, I think they would be on the side of the scale in favor of the Book of Mormon. Okay, I'm just being honest with that. Like, in terms of evidence, like, there are men who claim they saw the golden plates, and they swore to it, and they repeated that claim more than once, right? And so, okay, we just have to, let's talk about kind of what that means and, how we should approach that, like, say, as Catholics. So just as background, we talked about the golden plates. This is really important because Joseph Smith had these golden plates, but he was prohibited from showing them to people. He would keep them in a box. He would keep them in a sack. He would keep them in a stump outside, he would say. People were not allowed to look at them. He told people that if they did look at them, that he would die, that Joseph would die if someone looked at them without permission. And so he kept these things very secret. As they got close to the publication of the Book of Mormon, the text of the book itself said that 3 witnesses would see the plates and bear witness to the book. So one of the last things that Joseph Smith dictated to the Book of Mormon was a sort of prophecy contained within the book that 3 witnesses would bear witness to this work. And because of that, certain men started coming forward to Joseph Smith and saying, could I be one of those witnesses? Do you think I could be one of those witnesses? You said that 3 will see it. I would love to be one of those 3. Mm. Eventually, 2 sets of witnesses produced statements saying they had seen the plates. There's the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. Now, Jacob mentions a few other quote-unquote witnesses that are sort of known as like informal witnesses. These are people who often much later sort of remembered like, oh, I remember when Joseph Smith was translating, I went and I felt the plates under a cloth or something like that, right? But they're not nearly as formal. Their statements are often secondhand. Not that there's objectively anything wrong with a secondhand statements from a historical standpoint, but I'm not going to deal with all of those. They're not like these other ones who claim to have like held the plates or seen the pages altered and that sort of thing. So in the front of the Book of Mormon, we have the testimony of the witnesses, the 3 and the 8. These are long paragraphs, and so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the 3 witnesses claim that they were shown the plates by the power of God, meaning that an angel appeared to them. He says here, we testify that we have seen the engravings which are upon the plates, and they have been shown unto us by the power of God and not of man. We declare with words of soberness that an angel of God came down from heaven, and he brought and laid before our eyes, and we beheld and saw the plates and the engravings thereon. Okay, so they have a type of a very sort of spiritual, visionary type experience. An angel comes and brings the plates and shows it to them. The testimony of the 8 witnesses is much more prosaic. They basically say, just so everyone knows, he says, be it known, Joseph Smith has shown unto us the plates which he's spoken of. They have the appearance of gold. And as many of the leaves Smith has translated, we handled with our hands. We saw the engravings, and these have the appearance of ancient work. We say this with words of soberness, that he showed them to us, and we have seen and hefted, and know of a surety that he's got the plates which he has spoken. So they don't mention an angel. They don't really mention a spiritual experience. There's actually very little record of exactly how this occurred. Like later, no one really has like a reminiscence about when this happened. Like, did it happen with all of them at once? Were there different groups that saw it? We just kind of have this statement. So it is true that none of these witnesses explicitly denied their testimony. None of them said, I was lying, right? As we'll see, they did say things that complicate the picture quite a bit, but none of them ever said, I was in on it, or I was just making this up, or I was deceived, or anything like that. And many of them reiterated it throughout their lives, some on their deathbed, just like Jacob said. Some of them made it their dying thing, like my testimony of the Book of Mormon and seeing the plates is true, that sort of thing. And they maintained this even though many of them were excommunicated from the church or otherwise broke with the LDS church. And that's significant because the incentive to maintain it, if it were a ruse, would certainly at least go down, right? It wouldn't go to 0 because then they'd have to admit that they'd been lying and signed their names to an affidavit lying. So it's not, sometimes LDS apologists will say they had just no incentive to keep it up. Well, that's not true. If you've been in a big lie, it's very damaging to your reputation to admit that you've been in on it. Right. But certainly the incentive goes down, right? It's much less incentive if you no longer believe in Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm. So it's impressive on the one hand that though they were excommunicated or broke away, they kept on reiterating their testimony.
That's
on
right.
the other hand, it's overselling to say that they had no reason because possibly, when you're in too deep, you can't just pull back now.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and then they also made conflicting statements about what their experience was. So I'm going to focus on the 3 witnesses because they are the ones we have the most the most historical record about. Okay. So we have to keep in mind that they lived at a time where spiritual sight was considered as real as physical sight. So when they say things like, there's many quotes of them saying things like, I saw, do you see these eyes? These are the eyes I saw with, right? It's tempting to read those and say they're clearly saying that they weren't in a sort of spiritual or trance-like state or visionary state, but that is not at all what it would imply to people of the time period. Now, we also have more details about their experience that complicate the simple narrative that the official statement gives. And the official statement is just, it makes it sound like they're all together at the same time, that an angel appears, shows them the plates, and then it leaves. And they're kind of like, wow, what an experience that was. Joseph Smith himself later wrote in the History of the Church that on the day of the experience, he led the three of them into the wood. So first of all, Joseph was there. The statement never says that Joseph was there, but we know that he was. He led them into the woods, and they all knelt in the woods in a quiet place, and he asked each of them to pray individually, begging that God would show them the plates. Okay, so here we first of all see that the plates are not, at least at this time or for whatever reason, they're not a simple object that Joseph Smith can just produce, right? It's not like, here's the plates, I've got them in this box, I'm going to open it and you'll see it, right? But this is something they're begging God to give to them, and nothing happens. Okay, they are unsuccessful at seeing the plates. There's no angel, there's no plates. Martin Harris then excuses himself. He says, I'm the reason that this vision's not happening because I'm a wicked man. I'm going to leave. So he stands up and leaves. Martin's one of the three witnesses. So this leaves Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer remaining. And Joseph writes that then the three of them have this visionary experience after Martin has left. Then sometimes later, when this is done, Joseph goes searching for Martin, and he finds Martin in prayer in the woods alone. And Martin says, I still haven't seen the plates. And this is what Joseph wrote later. He said, we accordingly joined in prayer and ultimately obtained our desires. For before we had yet finished, the same vision was opened to our view. At least it was again opened to me. And I once more beheld and heard the same things. Whilst at the same moment, Martin Harris cried out, apparently in an ecstasy of joy, 'tis enough, 'tis enough. Mine eyes have beheld, mine eyes have beheld. And jumping up, he shouted, Hosanna, blessing God, and otherwise rejoiced exceedingly. So this is a very interesting experience. One thing that I want to point out is that in this reminiscence, Joseph actually almost casts doubt about what Martin saw. You'll notice he says, the same vision was open to our view. At least it was again opened to me. And I once more beheld and heard the same things. Never actually mentioning what Martin saw, which I just find interesting. It does kind of speak to a very kind of subjective experience. Like each person may have been experiencing something slightly different, right? When they're kind of like seeing these plates and the angel. So I want to look over a statement that Martin Harris made about 9 years later in 1838 when he lived in Kirtland, Ohio. So at this time, Martin Harris, which was one of the three witnesses, most of the saints had gathered to a small city in the northern Ohio, right along one of the Great Lakes, called Kirtland, Ohio, or right near it. And during this time, it was a great moment of turmoil in the early Latter-day Saint movement. Joseph Smith founded a bank, which failed, and it caused a major financial crisis in Kirtland and for church members. So people who had converted to Mormonism and moved to Kirtland had put all their money into the bank and buying property, and then the bank failed, and suddenly everyone had lost everything. And there were other reasons. There were actually questions about some of Joseph Smith's personal life. At this time, this is one of the first times that questions of like early secret polygamy practices pops up as well. And because of all of this, many people become disaffected from Joseph Smith. Okay, so the context of the quote we're going to read is that the Latter-day Saints who were disillusioned with Joseph Smith began to meet together to figure out what to do, right? They were like, what do we believe now? We think Joseph Smith's not a true prophet, at least not anymore. Do we still believe in the Book of Mormon, right? And so there were discussions about that sort of thing. At one of those meetings, Martin Harris made a statement that was attested to by multiple independent people. Okay, so we have at least two people who at the time wrote down what Martin Harris said. So this is secondhand, but it's quite well attested. And what they say is extremely similar. So the one I'm going to read to you is a letter written from someone who was at that meeting named Stephen Burnett. And he was writing to Lyman Johnson, who was actually I think Lyman Johnson was one of the 12 apostles that Joseph had called, and who would also become disaffected from the church. defenders of the Book of Mormon will say that Burnett is an antagonistic source, that he had that he shouldn't be trusted because he had a falling out with Joseph Smith and had some kind of motivation to exaggerate or whatever. I think you'll notice as we read this that he's more sad than antagonistic. And as I mentioned, this statement by Martin Harris is also backed up by another independent person. So he said, "I have long reflected and deliberated upon the history of this church and weighed the evidence for and against it, loath to give it up. But when I came to hear Martin Harris state in public that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver Cowdery nor David Whitner, also that the 8 witnesses never saw them and hesitated to sign that instrument for that reason, but were persuaded to do it, the last pedestal gave way. After we were done speaking, Martin Harris arose and said he was sorry for any man who rejected the Book of Mormon, for he knew it was true. He said he had hefted the plates repeatedly in a box with only a tablecloth or handkerchief over them, but he never saw them, only as he saw a city through a mountain. And he said that he should never have told that the testimony of the 8 was false if it had not been picked out of air, but should have let it pass as it was." So I think this is a very, very important statement. Now, this is not even the only, I mentioned we have multiple attestations of this. There are also other statements made by other witnesses that kind of speak to the subjective nature of their visions, if that makes sense. Here, Martin expresses regret. Some LDS apologists have taken the second paragraph where it says Martin was sorry that anyone reject the Book of Mormon, as if to say that he felt like they were taking his quote out of context. But I think it's clear from the paragraph that what Martin is sorry about is that what he told is causing people to not believe in the Book of Mormon. Because Martin very much believed in the Book of Mormon and did through his entire life. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's very important also that he mentions the 8 witnesses not seeing the plates with their physical eyes. As I mentioned before, the official statement of the 3 witnesses and the detailed version that Joseph Smith gave are very different from each other, right? So what this tells us is that you can't read this official statement and take from that a simple take it as like a literal simple reconstruction of what happened. We don't have a reminiscent from the 8. We don't have details like that. But I think we have enough from the 3 witnesses to tell us that there's good reason to think that what they experienced was not as simple and prosaic as what they say in their non-detailed statement. So there's a lot that has been written on the witnesses, and I want to recommend 2 resources if people are really interested in this topic. And the first one is a defense of the witnesses by an LDS scholar named Richard Lloyd Anderson. That's this one, Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses. He's a faithful Latter-day Saint. He goes through all of the statements. He privileges statements that he thinks are more reliable, and he says that statements like this Burnett one he feels are less reliable, and he'll give his reasons. There's another LDS historian named Dan Vogel who has written about the witnesses in many venues, but he has 2 really good YouTube videos. They're each about an hour that summarizes his research that he's published in other venues, and goes through all of the quotes and responds directly to Richard Lloyd Anderson's work as well. So if people are interested in kind of like the nitty gritty, like who said what, because like I said, there's so many statements from the witnesses, and some people, LDS apologists, will often want to say, we should just take the statements where they say things like, I saw them with my eyes at face value. And then statements like this one from Martin Harris, we should discount because they'll give reasons, right? It's secondhand, or it contradicts other statements that they consider more reliable or whatever. But the truth is that it's complicated. The witnesses, at least one of the 8 witnesses also said that he saw the plates by a supernatural power, which does not make it sound like it was a prosaic day in the woods where Joseph Smith just opened the book. Here you go. Take a look. Hold this if you want to, if that makes sense. Do you have any questions or comments about that right now?
And the scandal is that if they didn't actually see the physical plates, then is it that maybe Joseph Smith just made up that there were these physical plates? Is it that we don't have anyone else really verifying their existence?
Yeah.
What is the scandal? Mm-hmm.
I will give you. I think that Dan Vogel has good insights here, which is that he believes that Joseph Smith was very good at the power of suggestion.
Yeah.
And at helping people kind of see. You'll notice, like, from the experience of the three, that they started in long, long prayer, right? Intense prayer and expectation. And Joseph Smith had a history prior to the Book of Mormon of being a treasure digger, where he would look into a stone and say that he saw treasure, and people would say, "Oh, I see it too." Do you know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of kind of experiences like this where through the power of suggestion, I think it's possible for people to kind of see things with a sort of spiritual eye that they wouldn't normally see without someone there to sort of guide them through the experience.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Dan Vogel, again, he details that. He sometimes gets mocked and disparaged by apologists saying, like, oh, they thought Joseph was a hypnotist, a trained hypnotist or something, right? It's not anything as exotic as that. Just simply that it's very interesting that Joseph was present for all of these experiences and that he was kind of the one leading them along.
If I can just add something, this reminds me of so my parents are still Baptists, and they often will do worship with other kind of people from the region where I'm from, in northeastern India / Myanmar, that kind of area. People who have immigrated here to the US. And sometimes they like engage the community. They engage in more like Pentecostal forms of worship, whereas my parents being Baptist, they're used to something a bit different, right?
Yeah.
And one time they brought in this faith healer, and my mom is a skeptic through and through. Well, I shouldn't say through and through, but she just doesn't really believe in the whole like faith healing thing. Like how some Pentecostals will do it with a handkerchief, or they'll do something and then, all that, right? But my mom went up on stage anyway, and this guy, he like breathed on her, or like, blew, I don't know, something, maybe just like on his hand like that. And my mom fell backwards, and people had to catch her, as she was going down. And my mom was like, I have no idea what happened. And she says, like, I don't believe that this is, I didn't go into this believing that this was going to happen. But I think like there was something there, maybe of the power of suggestion or something like that, like, I don't interpret that as necessarily being like the real deal.
Yeah. Well, and so Jacob said in this debate that if you make an argument against the Book of Mormon Witnesses, you are going to automatically undercut the resurrection witnesses, right? And so let's talk about that really quickly, because I think that there are some very significant basic differences here. The first is that the resurrection witnesses were not expecting the experience. The Bible, the New Testament, goes to pains to tell us that not only did the apostles did not understand that the resurrection was coming. They didn't, and even when they first heard about it, they didn't believe it. They thought it was idle tales, right? So the first women who approached the tomb, who were the first ones to see the risen Lord, were not expecting to see the risen Lord that day. They were shocked. When Jesus appeared with the 12 in the locked room, they had thought that the women were lying, or were just being kind of, oh, those silly women, overexcitable and thinking they'd seen Jesus, right? Thomas was a skeptical witness. He didn't go into it thinking like, I'm going to see something today. And importantly, we have Paul, right? Paul is an antagonistic source. It would be, the equivalent would be if Joseph Smith took a skeptic of Mormonism into the woods, someone who absolutely did not believe and thought he was a fraud, and then showed them the plates. That would be a much more impressive witness than taking 3 of his most loyal followers, or 8. The 8 witnesses were all either related to Joseph Smith. 4 of them were members of his family, and the other 4 were members of the Whitmer family, who were very, very close with him. And so they were all strong believers before the experience occurred. We also know that the apostles confirmed their witness throughout their life through the working of miracles and through martyrdom. Jacob made a point at one point saying that these Book of Mormon witnesses had a threat to their lives because of mob violence against the Mormons. But that is just simply not the same as someone who knows that they're going to end up martyred for going around preaching Christ, and then ends up actually being martyred for saying that Jesus is the Christ and that they saw him risen. None of the witnesses were martyred or killed because of what they said. And so I think that you can make very clear contrasts with the resurrection witnesses, and even give reasons why, even if you think that there could be a power of suggestion going on with the Book of Mormon Witnesses, that's very unlikely to be the case for the resurrection. There's just no indication. You could always theorize, well, maybe there was, but we don't have any evidence that that's the case. There's nothing that says like Peter was bidding them all to pray that they might see the Lord, right? They were praying. It doesn't say what they're praying about. It's certainly, even when he appears, they're afraid, right? They're kind of like, it's a ghost, right? Like they don't believe that it's him at first, So we just don't have evidence that there was a kind of power of suggestion going on anyway, for this, if this power of suggestion thing seems plausible to you, I'd strongly recommend Dan Vogel's YouTube videos, which summarize his work, and then some of the books that he's written and some of his published scholarly articles also go into that theory. So, yeah. Okay, we got this is the last section.
Okay, and this is going to be this hot topic. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about Joseph Smith's polygamy. So obviously this doesn't have direct bearing on the Book of Mormon, right? But it did come up in the debate multiple times. And I want to specifically address Jacob's claim at one point where when Trent was talking about polygamy, Jacob said, well, we just don't know that much about Joseph Smith's polygamy. And he accused Trent of trafficking in rumors and antagonistic sources and that sort of like saying like, you just like this because it's like these salacious rumors. The truth is, it's just kind of like this fog of history. We just can't really know, right? Before we get there, first of all, I'll just spoilers. That's not true. We have a lot of direct evidence, including firsthand statements from many, many people about this. So we know a lot. But I first want to talk about, is this relevant, right? Because what about popes and bishops who are bad people, right? Are we in glass houses throwing stones, right? When we kind of probe this question of Joseph Smith's polygamy. And I'm going to make the case briefly that no, we are not, that this is relevant. And I want to talk specifically about why prophets require extra scrutiny when we are trying to decide whether someone's a true prophet. And the key reason is prophets arrive outside any existing authority structure, okay? So there's many, many warnings in Scripture about discerning false prophets, both the Old and the New Testament. But you'll notice that there's no warnings about being careful about a false high priest, for instance, okay? And why would that be? Because the high priest is a publicly acknowledged office, sort of like the Pope. It's pretty easy to tell who the Pope is most of the time. Very, very few instances in history where that might not be the case. Similarly, even in Jesus's day, the high priest was a bad guy, a wicked man, but everyone acknowledged him as high priest. Even Paul, when he is struck in the face in the book of Acts for mouthing off against the high priest, acknowledges he didn't know who he was speaking to, but then he says, if I'd known, I wouldn't have said that because you are the high priest, right? But prophets come out of nowhere, right? A man or a woman stands up and says, I have a message from the Lord. And we know that God works this way sometimes. He does directly call people to carry a message. But because they have no public ministry, they have not received authority from one that is known to have authority. They are claiming their own authority and require extra scrutiny. So an evil pope or bishop simply makes them an evil pope or bishop, but it doesn't make them not pope or not bishop, right? Whereas an evil prophet goes directly against the kind of tests that we are told to look at to see whether or not someone is a true prophet.
And let me just add here too that like with the office of like high priest in ancient Judaism, there were sects in ancient Judaism who complained about the high priest not being a valid high priest, but their complaint was he wasn't from the right tribe, or the complaint was that, the Hasmoneans had illegitimately usurped the Davidic monarchy and blended the high priesthood with the monarchy or whatever. So the complaint was never just he was a bad guy, so he doesn't have the office. Right. It was, here's this institutional thing that seems to have gone wrong. And also the fact that he's a bad guy is like icing on the cake for their case.
Yeah. So as Catholics, the founder of our movement is Jesus Christ. Or you can maybe say the founder is St. Peter, right? Since Jesus stayed in the Holy Land and then the apostles spread out to spread the word. I would say that the relevant corollary would be to probe the moral lives of these people, right? And I would simply say, if Jesus was morally compromised, we should not follow him. Okay. I will just say that that's true. If Jesus said, I'm the Son of God, I'm also doing all these immoral things on the side, but seriously, I'm the Son of God, we should reject that, right? We don't accept Pope Francis as the Pope because he's a particularly moral person, or because he is a particularly insightful theologian, or because he's a worker of miracles. We accept him because he has ascended to a known office, an office which is known to carry authority. So he carries that authority. So I just want to briefly look at Matthew 7, where Christ says, beware of false prophets who will come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Thus, I'm going to skip a little bit. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one that does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And I will declare unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So a brief exegesis on this thorns and thistles line at the beginning. I am not a biblical scholar. I know you're studying to be a biblical scholar, so you can correct me if I say something amiss here. But it has been pointed out by others who are biblical scholars that the thorns and thistles here almost certainly refer back to Genesis 3, where Adam is cursed because of the fall and said that the ground will now produce thorns and thistles. And so by Christ saying, are the fruits being gathered from thorns and thistles? Meaning among the fruits, is there a root of sinfulness that is coming forth from this prophet, from these fruits? Okay. I think that this makes the evaluation of the moral life of a prophet actually extremely relevant. Not in the pursuit of perfection. Okay. This is a common thing. Latter-day Saints will say, well, you're expecting prophets to be perfect. And we know that people like Moses, he did all sorts of presumptuous things before the Lord and was a very imperfect person. And that's true. But on some of the most basic questions of natural law, we only have indication that Moses was a moral person, right? So that's just kind of like a quick aside at the beginning, like, why are we even looking at this? How can we as Catholics, because we acknowledge we've had many evil popes and bishops, how can we even dare bring this up? Well, I think that it is perfectly fine to dare, okay? And I think it's not only perfectly fine, I think it's necessary, because it gets to kind of the question of who Joseph Smith was. So we're going to look at the specific case of a young girl named Lucy Walker, and we're going to kind of test Jacob's theory about whether or not we're dealing in salacious rumor and whether or not we just don't know very much about Joseph Smith's polygamy. So Lucy was born in 1826. She was much younger than Joseph Smith, who was born in 1805. Okay, so Joseph Smith was 21 years her senior, if I'm doing that math right. In early 1842, when Lucy was only 15, her mother died and left behind 10 children. So this is what Lucy wrote herself. So this is firsthand account from Lucy, okay, from later. She said, "What were we to do? My father's health seemed to give way under this heavy affliction. The prophet came to our rescue." That's Joseph Smith. He said, "If you remain here, Brother Walker," that's her father, "you will soon follow your wife to the grave. You must have a change of scene, a change of climate. You have just such a family as I could love. My house shall be their house. I will adopt them as my own." So Lucy's mother dies, and Joseph Smith ends up sending her father, Walker, on a mission away from where they were living at the time in Illinois, and leaving the 10 children behind. So the 6 younger children go stay with other family and neighbors, but the 4 older children, including Lucy, move into Joseph Smith's house and live with him. So this is directly from Lucy herself. She wrote this later in her life, I think in like, do I have this in 18? Okay, I can't remember exactly when this was, when she was older, and she's writing about her own experiences with polygamy with Joseph Smith. So again, this is a firsthand account. And this is a bit long, but I think this is very important because it will reveal a lot of details. Nothing that Lucy says here is unique, okay? There are other accounts that mirror this one exactly, very similar. In the year 1842, when Lucy was 16, President Joseph Smith sought an interview with me and said, "I have a message for you. I have been commanded of God to take another wife, and you are the woman." My astonishment knew no bounds. This announcement was indeed a thunderbolt to me. He asked me if I believed him to be a prophet of God. Most assuredly I do, I replied. He fully explained to me the principle of plural or celestial marriage. He said this principle was again to be restored for the benefit of the human family, that it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house, and would form a chain that could never be broken, worlds without end. What have you to say? He asked. Nothing. How could I speak, or what could I say? He said, if you will pray sincerely for light and understanding in relation thereto, you shall receive a testimony of the correctness of this principle. I thought I prayed sincerely, but was so unwilling to consider the matter favorably that I fear I did not ask in faith for light. Gross darkness instead of light took possession of my mind. I was tempted and tortured beyond endurance until life was not desirable. Oh, that the grave would kindly receive me, that I might find rest on the bosom of my dear mother. Why should I be chosen from among thy daughters, Father? I am only a child in years and experience, no mother to counsel, no father near to tell me what to do in this trying hour. Oh, let this bitter cup pass. And thus I prayed in the agony of my soul. So I honestly find that very difficult to read. Like it affects me so much to hear this girl, this woman, she's a woman when she writes this, remembering just the torture she felt with this authority figure in her life. And her parents were gone, right? Mother dead, father away, and was living in Joseph Smith's house. He was her guardian. He was her legal guardian.
And on top of that, she believes him to be a prophet.
That's right.
So
yeah, he's in spiritual authority over her. Yeah. The prophet, she goes on, I'm continuing. The prophet discerned my sorrow. He said, this principle will yet be believed in and practiced by the righteous. I have no flattering words to offer. It is a command of God to you. I will give you until tomorrow to decide this matter. If you reject this message, the gate will be closed forever against you. This aroused every drop of scotch in my veins. For a few moments, I stood fearless before him and looked him in the eye. And I took out some for brevity here. He walked across the room, returned, and stood before me with the most beautiful expression of countenance and said, God Almighty bless you. You shall have a manifestation of the will of God concerning you, a testimony that you can never deny. I will tell you what it shall be. It shall be that joy and peace you never knew. Oh, this is the last portion of her remembrance. Oh, how earnestly I prayed for these words to be fulfilled. It was near dawn, after another sleepless night, when my room was lighted up by a heavenly influence. To me it was, in comparison, like the brilliant sun bursting through the darkest cloud. The words of the prophet were indeed fulfilled. My soul was filled with a calm, sweet peace that I never knew. Supreme happiness took possession of me, and I received a powerful and irresistible testimony of the truth of plural marriage, which has been like an anchor to my soul through all the trials of life. I felt that I must go out into the morning air and give vent to the joy and gratitude that filled my soul. As I descended the stairs, because remember, she's living in his house, President Smith opened the door below, took me by the hand, and said, thank God, you have the testimony. I too have prayed. He led me to a chair, placed his hands upon my head, and blessed me with every blessing my heart could possibly desire. The first day of May, 1843, I consented to become the prophet's wife and was sealed to him for time and all eternity at his own house by Elder William Clayton. Okay, so I intentionally left in this last portion because she does have the experience that Joseph Smith said she would have, right? Mm-hmm. Joseph Smith's like, if you'll pray about this, God will tell you that it's right. But I think it's significant that, if she says at first she didn't, right? She's like, oh, I must not have been sincere. I must not have actually had faith. And it wasn't until Joseph Smith gives her a deadline, right, that she stays up all night praying, says has a sleepless night. And just before the dawn, she has this kind of experience. And she does become a defender of polygamy for the rest of her life. Anyway, I don't remember exactly her history after Joseph Smith. Many of Joseph's wives ended up then becoming the wives of other prominent church leaders after he died. And so, many times LDS apologists will kind of look to this and be like, well, look, she gained her own testimony of it. For me personally, I can kind of see the pattern of someone of manipulation, of authority, of someone who has very little choice, right? I mean, what's she going to do if she says no? She would be rejecting the prophet of God she believes in, the man who is her legal guardian, the person who's the head of the household she lives in. She just has no other options. And I think that most people would recognize that when an adult approaches in authority, approaches a teenager and applies pressure to them, even if the teenager acquiesces and comes to agree, we recognize that that's not a moral or proper thing to do.
Yeah, I don't see how you can clean that up,
Yeah.
No.
So this is kind of a summary. And the last thing is that Jacob said at one point in the debate that there are no children born to Joseph Smith outside of his first wife, Emma, or at least no known children. And that is true. That certainly, though, would imply that sort of implies that the relationship with these women was not sexual. And we know that they were sexual because these women said so, right? So this is, again, Lucy Walker in 1887. She wrote, "I am able to testify that Emma Smith, the prophet's first wife, gave her consent to the marriage of at least 4 other girls to her husband, and that she was well aware that he associated with them as wives within the meaning of all that word implies." So especially given that this is the Victorian era and they're going to kind of dance around the topic a little bit, that's as explicit of a statement as you can possibly get. And then in 1892, she was part of a trial, actually, where she testified under oath and was asked the question, "Did you live with Joseph Smith as his wife?" And again, with the context of the time, this question is specifically saying, okay, was the relationship sexual, right? It's not just saying, it's not saying, oh, you were sealed in secret. Did you live with him as his wife?
Right.
And you can kind of see that where he associated with them as wives, right? Like this is mirroring that language. And she answered directly, "He was my husband, sir." And so every LDS scholar that I know of, even like believing LDS scholars, agrees that this was a sexual relationship with Lucy Walker. And so she's a really, really good case study. There are many others. He does have a wife who's younger than Lucy Walker, although that relationship, it's a little more murky. It's not, we don't know if it was like a sexual relationship. I intentionally chose this one because it's kind of emblematic of the system as a whole. There are other teenagers, older teenagers like 18, 19 that he married, where they also specifically said that their relationship was sexual and that sort of thing. So there's just no question. And this pattern, Joseph actually had a pattern of inviting girls into his home. And while they were living with him, he would introduce the principle of plural marriage to them, tell them that God had commanded him to marry them, and then would marry them. And so those are just the facts of the case. If people want a book to read, the best book on this topic I've read is called In Sacred Loneliness. And it's written by an LDS scholar. I believe that he's still active LDS scholar. And it is a historical overview of every wife of Joseph Smith. So every wife has her own chapter. He was sealed to at least 34 by the time he died. And the book is incredible. Honestly, like you read this book, you fall in love with these women, right? They were just incredible people. They have incredible stories. It's a wonderful book because it centers their experience rather than Joseph Smith's, and tells their whole life story, the ways in which polygamy affected them and changed the course of their lives and that sort of thing. So I very, very strongly recommend that book. If anyone really wants to just kind of cut through all of the noise on polygamy and just go to this scholarly work, it tells every woman's story in context, and it's a fascinating read. I mean, it's gripping, just great. It's like every chapter is a 30 or 40 page independent biography. So,
just two things, right? One is what does it mean to be sealed, right? Does that just mean marriage? Yes. Or because I remember Hansen kind of referred to marriage and sealing as if they were separate things.
Okay. I'm trying to think of how to describe this succinctly. In LDS theology, something is sealed if it has effect not only on earth, but into the eternities.
I see.
Okay. So the word sealing can be used to describe more than just the sealing between like a husband and wife. In LDS theology, they also talk about children being sealed. So in this quote that I read, right here, this part, it says, "It would form a chain that could never be broken, world without end," right? That is directly referencing this sealing theology. The sealing theology in Mormonism has changed throughout time, but essentially that's what it refers to. Now, there were some marriages some polygamous marriages that Joseph Smith had that seem that were not sexual, that we know were not sexual, right? We know that some were because we have the testimony of the women themselves, and we know that some weren't for similar reasons and similar inferences, right? So what Jacob was referring to there is trying to say something like, oh, well, there were some women where they were just sealed, as in a bond was formed that they believed would carry on through the eternities, but they never lived as husband and wife while on earth, as in they didn't have sexual relationship. But one like this, I mean, this is like spiritually, this is what it means to live as husband and wife. Did you live with him as his wife? He was my husband, sir. We also know that there were some that very much did have sexual components, and they did live as husband and wife during their time on earth.
Yeah. The other thing I want to mention is that he talked about Aquinas and Augustine. Hansen talked about Aquinas and Augustine on plural marriage. And with Augustine, I think Augustine, and don't quote me on this, I know with Augustine, I think he says something like that was the custom of the time, right? So not, I mean, maybe somebody can fact check me on that, but it was not like a stirring endorsement, right, unto the ages. Whereas I know with Aquinas, from what I recall, being a student of Aquinas, he only said that it was permissible if it was necessary to like save the human race. And let's say there was one man left and multiple women. So just to throw out, oh, Aquinas and Augustine were okay with plural marriage without giving the full context of what were the conditions, at least. Like for both, I think it was, for Augustine, it was a limited time. For Aquinas, it was extraordinary circumstance.
And I think that you can also say that even if you stipulate that maybe God allows polygamy among his prophets, you know, like Abraham or something like that, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at certain times or whatever, there's certainly a difference between just plural marriage as a basic fact and a sort of pattern of cornering and pressuring teenage girls that, you know, are kind of under your authority to secretly have relations with you, which is something that Joseph Smith did multiple times. Like if people, you know, I would recommend they read the stories about Fanny Alger and the Partridge sisters, who follow a very similar pattern to what we see from Lucy here. So there's more than just he married multiple women. I mean, I do think as Catholics, because we believe that Christ came and that in the Christian revelation, we see monogamy as a sign of the wedding of Christ to the church and as the ideal of Christian marriage, there is a real theological objection to sort of say like, well, I'm bringing back this Old Testament thing. Like we don't bring back Old Testament things. We have the fuller revelation now, right? So that's kind of what I would say there. And I do want to briefly mention, it would be wrong, I think, to say that Joseph's only motivation in this was like for sexual pleasure.
Sure.
The theology that was built around sealing was not just, you know, to bind this man and this woman together, but it was about binding families together in a sort of salvific relationship that would carry on forever. And this is why she says here, it says like, it would prove an everlasting blessing to my father's house and form a chain that could never be broken. So in some ways, this amps the pressure on the girls because Joseph is basically saying, if you are sealed to me, your whole family will be saved, right? Because I'm going to be exalted as a god in the hereafter, and anyone sealed to me will get yanked up there with me with this chain, right? That was kind of the original theology. And they seemed to be very interested in establishing these sealing relationships with each other. And I think the motivation was beyond just, you know, I want to have sex with more women. I don't think that that's the full picture, but I also think that was also part of it and is pretty clearly part of it in my mind. So, okay, let me just give kind of like a brief general conclusions at the end. So on what principles do we have faith in the Catholic Church but reject Mormonism, right? Several times there was kind of this thrust to Jacob's argumentation sort of saying, if you accept the resurrection witnesses, you have to accept the Book of Mormon witnesses. If you accept the Bible, you should accept the Book of Mormon, right? And I think as a Catholic, it's very straightforward to just say, the object of our faith is Jesus Christ. With Christ being the object of our faith, like he is the one for whom we make this act of faith. We give ourselves to him as a person. And having given ourselves to him, we use Christ as the standard by which we measure all things, right? And Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, simply from a Catholic perspective, are not credible authorities on the Christian faith. The Book of Mormon is not what it claims to be. Joseph Smith is not a credible prophet, both because of the Book of Mormon, because of other things we never covered, like the Book of Abraham, and because of his moral questionability. And so when Jacob claims that anytime you use an argument against Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon, it will work equally against the Catholic faith or the Bible, I just think that's just totally not true. Jesus is unassailable morally. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be a Christian, right? And his resurrection is a clear miracle that backs up his claims. And this isn't to say that the resurrection is something we deduce by logical proof, but it is something that I think we can give ourselves over to in reasonable faith, accepting the absolute truthfulness of it in a way that we cannot do with Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. Oh, well, I kind of said this here. I just want to end with this. I want to just invite any Latter-day Saints or former Latter-day Saints to really just kind of approach traditional Christian faith with a kind of openness and willingness to kind of explore. I have a great sadness that a lot of people, when they leave the LDS faith, become atheists. And I think that for a lot of them, they become so burned by religion when they kind of discover some of the things about Mormonism that they didn't know, that they just kind of assume that all religion is of similar value or of similar questionability. And I just want to offer my own kind of witness that faith in Christ can be as intellectually, spiritually fulfilling and beautiful as you can possibly imagine it can be. And that I have found that in the Catholic Church. And so I, again, will invite anyone who's interested in that to go to listen to that Matt Fradd interview. I've listed an email here if anyone's interested in getting in contact with me. I can't promise to respond or even quickly, but I do try to respond to people. So if anyone's just like really interested, feel free to reach out. And finally, if I could just ask you to pray for me and a few of my intentions. I have a close family member who's battling cancer, and I've been battling an injury in my foot for the last year and a half that has really hobbled me. And I would just love for people's prayers. Just pray for me and pray for my family and for the loved ones we have that are sick. I know everyone has prayers that they need, but can't pass up the opportunity to ask an audience for prayers. So that's it. That's my presentation.
Isaac, thank you so much for sharing. And just, I mean, at the start of the presentation, we wanted to focus more on Hansen specific comments, but I think these general conclusions are very appropriate for everything that we've touched on. And I do appreciate you just giving that invitation for people, and I hope that they'll take it to heart. Now, I thought that I had unlimited time, but I saw that the library is closing in about 8 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And so we only have like 3 questions that people have sent in. So I think we can hit those pretty quickly. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
Oh, so Griffin Gartner asked, did Smith have a shifting Trinitarian theology from the Book of Mormon to his later writings? I've seen some compelling argumentation that Smith was at one point a modalist.
Yes. In my reading of the history, the answer to that question is exactly yes. He does seem to have a modalist theology in the Book of Mormon, for instance, which is his earliest theological work. He specifically says, for instance, in the Book of Mormon, he has a whole chapter where he tries to explain why Jesus is both the Father and the Son. And it kind of it does not at all fit well with the later LDS theology that separate the Father and the Son as totally separate beings. And so he had shifting theology about who the Father and the Son are. You can trace this very clearly through time and see it developing as he goes. So the answer to that question is yes.
Okay, Storyteller asked, does Isaac think Smith was a complete conscious fraud, or did he genuinely believe he was inspired in some sense and perhaps made up some stuff to boost his authority?
Why not both? I think that Joseph Smith lived in a time of great religious confusion and upheaval, and that religious confusion affected his family very personally. The way I read the early Joseph Smith is that he wants to produce something that will resolve theological questions, especially within his own family. His father and his mother disagreed about religious things a lot. And I think he viewed the Book of Mormon. I think he knew that he was not writing a true history, but I think that he thought he was called by God to produce the book in order to resolve theological questions that were then very hot. And And this was noticed at the time. People were saying things like, boy, it's really convenient that this ancient works just answers every theological question of our day, right? Whether it's infant baptism, grace versus works, limited or infinite atonement. You know what I mean? Like all of these things are addressed in universalism versus non-universalism. They're all addressed in the Book of Mormon pretty directly. And I think as time went on, Joseph Smith continuously believed that he was called by God to perform a work. And I think that he thought that his calling gave him justification to do things that we would consider dishonest. I don't know whether he thought it was dishonest or not, but that he knew were not factually true. That's my opinion on it.
Conrad Sardo asked, for both hosts, what is the best way for a Catholic to talk to an LDS about the great apostasy? Maybe I'll go first really quick, and then if you like my answer, we could probably move on to the last question. I remember one time some LDS reached out to me, and I just wanted to be nice, so I talked to them. And I just kind of said, look, a lot of the stuff that you're saying about needing a magisterium, needing like somebody like a prophet, or at least divine guidance for the church, I totally agree with. I just think that Christ already got from the get-go dealt with that question, that need of the church, by establishing not only the bishops, but also the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to be perpetual successors to the apostles and to Peter, to help give the church that stability. And so I would say there, like, if you can begin with common ground and just build up to, but why not just say that Christ, our Lord, got it right from the beginning, rather than having things kind of tailspin right after the apostles died?
Yep, I think that's a good answer. Yep.
All right, last question. IBDL asked, has there been any Catholic scholarly work in analyzing the LDS's usage of witness testimony as evidence for their claims, then applying said usage towards Catholic miracles, where witness testimony plays a pivotal role in establishing its genuineness as a miracle? So I guess first, Catholic scholarly work analyzing LDS use of witness testimony.
Not that I know of. I don't know of any scholarly work.
And then applying said usage towards Catholic miracles. Okay. So
I will say this. When the Catholic Church approves a miracle, what the church is saying is that we are free to believe that it's a miracle, but they're not saying with any kind of dogmatic authority that a miracle truly occurred. I think that there are some instances in Catholic history of very, very genuine miracles. And I think there are some instances in Catholic history of probably non-genuine miracles, or even things that fit into the same kinds of suggestion box that I mentioned already. So, yeah.
All right. The bell is ringing, so I got to get going.
Yeah,
but yeah,
you're getting
I will
out.
talk to you later.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you to everybody watching.